Welcome, true believers, to a journey through the shadows of Spider-Man's world. Tonight, we'll explore the complete rogues gallery of the web-slinger, from his most notorious enemies to the forgotten foes who shaped his legend. This is a tale of transformation and tragedy, of brilliant minds twisted by circumstance and ordinary people pushed beyond their breaking points. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through 60 years of villainy. We'll move slowly and steadily through each dark origin, each moment of corruption that created Marvel's most memorable antagonists. There's no rush here, just let these stories of fallen souls wash over you, like shadows cast by New York's towering skyline. Our story begins in the early 1960s, when Spider-Man was still finding his footing as both hero and man. It was an era of scientific optimism and nuclear promise, when the atom seemed to hold infinite potential for both creation and destruction. Into this world of boundless possibility and underlying anxiety came the first great enemies of our wall-crawling hero, villains whose origins would establish the template for decades of tragic transformation and corrupted brilliance. These weren't simple criminals driven by greed or power alone, though those motivations certainly played their part. These were complex individuals, often brilliant in their own right, whose personal tragedies and fatal flaws would transform them into the very threats they once might have helped to prevent. They were scientists and businessmen, immigrants and outcasts, each carrying within them the seeds of their own destruction, waiting only for the right catalyst to bloom into villainy. The foundation of Spider-Man's rogues gallery was built not on simple good versus evil, but on the more complex themes of responsibility and consequence, of power corrupted and brilliance misdirected. These early villains would establish patterns that would echo through decades of storytelling, showing us that the line between hero and villain is often thinner than we'd like to believe. In those formative years of Spider-Man's career, when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were crafting the mythology that would define the character for generations to come, they understood something fundamental about human nature. They knew that the most compelling villains aren't born evil, but made so by circumstances, choices, and the cruel twists of fate that can transform a brilliant scientist into a megalomaniacal monster or a respected businessman into a cackling madman. The genius of these early antagonists lay not just in their colorful costumes and spectacular powers, but in their tragic humanity. Each represented a different path that Peter Parker himself might have taken if he had made different choices. If he had allowed his power to corrupt him rather than inspire him to greater responsibility. They were dark mirrors of our hero, showing us what Spider-Man might have become if tragedy had hardened his heart instead of opening it to compassion. Dr. Otto Octavius began his life not as the megalomaniacal Doctor Octopus, but as a brilliant nuclear physicist whose contributions to science might have changed the world for the better. Born into a household dominated by an abusive father and an overprotective mother, Otto learned early that intellect was both his shield and his sword, the one thing that set him apart from his tormentors, and gave him a sense of worth in a world that seemed determined to crush his spirit. His childhood was a study in contradictions that would shape the man he would become. His father, a brutal construction worker who saw his son's bookish nature as weakness, would beat Otto for any perceived slight, teaching him that power was the only currency that mattered in life. Meanwhile, his mother smothered him with affection that was equally damaging, treating him as her precious genius while isolating him from normal childhood experiences and relationships. This toxic combination of abuse and overprotection created a young man who was simultaneously arrogant about his intellectual gifts and desperately insecure about his worth as a human being. Otto learned to retreat into the safe world of science, where equations never lied and experiments followed predictable rules, unlike the chaotic and painful world of human relationships that had caused him so much anguish. As he grew older and his brilliance became undeniable, Otto found himself rising through the ranks of the scientific community with meteoric speed. His doctoral thesis on nuclear fission was hailed as revolutionary. His research into atomic manipulation opened new frontiers in energy production, and his innovative use of mechanical appendages to handle dangerous radioactive materials made him a pioneer in laboratory safety protocols. But success in the laboratory could not heal the wounds of his childhood or teach him the social skills he had never been allowed to develop. Otto remained isolated, brilliant but bitter, respected by his colleagues, but never truly liked or understood. He began to see other people as variables in his equations, obstacles to be overcome, or tools to be manipulated, rather than fellow human beings deserving of respect and consideration. The mechanical arms that would eventually become fused to his body were originally his greatest achievement, a testament to his engineering genius and his understanding of both robotics and human physiology. These 4 additional appendages, controlled by a sophisticated harness that translated his neural impulses into precise mechanical movements, allowed him to perform delicate atomic research that would have been impossible with human hands alone. The arms became more than just tools to Otto. They became extensions of his will, perfect servants that never questioned his commands or failed to execute his instructions with flawless precision. In a life marked by disappointment and betrayal, these mechanical limbs were the only things he could truly trust, the only relationships that never let him down or caused him pain. The accident that would transform Otto Octavius into Doctor Octopus was, like so many of the origin stories in Spider-Man's world, a perfect storm of human error, technological hubris, and pure, random chance. An experiment in atomic fusion, designed to create a new form of clean energy that could power entire cities, went catastrophically wrong when a safety protocol was bypassed and a containment field failed. The explosion that followed bathed Otto in intense radiation, while simultaneously fusing his beloved mechanical arms permanently to his body. But the physical transformation was only the beginning of his metamorphosis. The radiation that bonded the arms to his nervous system also affected his brain, suppressing the neural pathways that governed empathy and social inhibition, while amplifying his already considerable arrogance and need for control. When Otto awoke in the hospital weeks later, he was no longer entirely human. The arms had become part of him, responding to his thoughts as naturally as his original limbs, but they carried with them an alien intelligence that whispered of power and dominance. The brilliant scientist who had once dreamed of bettering humanity through nuclear research was gone, replaced by a megalomaniac who saw other people as subjects to be ruled rather than served. The transformation was not merely physical but psychological and spiritual. Otto had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy despite his intellectual gifts, but now he possessed power that made him feel truly superior to ordinary humans. The arms gave him strength that could crush steel, reach that could span enormous distances, and dexterity that surpassed any human surgeon or craftsman. More intoxicating than the physical abilities, however, was the sense of completeness they provided. The feeling that he had finally become the perfect being his mother had always told him he was destined to be. But with great power came not great responsibility, as Peter Parker had learned, but great corruption. Otto's first criminal acts were petty things, thefts and vandalism that seemed almost beneath a man of his capabilities. But each successful crime fed his growing megalomania, proving to him that the rules that governed ordinary people no longer applied to someone of his enhanced abilities and superior intellect. It was inevitable that Doctor Octopus would eventually encounter Spider-Man, and their first battle established the template for their decades-long rivalry. Here were two beings enhanced by scientific accident, both possessing abilities that set them apart from ordinary humanity, but who had chosen radically different paths in response to their transformation. Where Spider-Man used his power to protect others, Doctor Octopus used his to dominate them. Where Peter Parker had learned that with great power comes great responsibility, Otto Octavius had concluded that with great power comes the right to do whatever one pleases. Their conflicts were never simply physical confrontations between superpowered beings, but philosophical debates conducted through action. Each battle was a test of competing worldviews, with Spider-Man representing the idea that power should be used in service of others, while Doctor Octopus embodied the belief that superior beings have the right to rule over their inferiors. The tragedy of Doctor Octopus lies not in his transformation, but in the waste of what he might have been. His brilliant mind, which could have solved the world's energy crisis, or unlocked the secrets of the atom for the benefit of all humanity, instead became focused solely on schemes for personal power and revenge. The mechanical arms that were designed to help him serve science became instruments of terror and oppression. Yet throughout his criminal career, glimpses of the man Otto once was occasionally surfaced. In rare moments of clarity or extreme stress, the brilliant scientist would emerge from behind the megalomaniac's mask, showing flashes of the compassion and dedication that had once driven his research. These moments served only to make his fall more tragic, reminding us that inside the metal-armed monster was still the ghost of a man who had once wanted to make the world a better place. If Doctor Octopus represented science corrupted by power, then Norman Osborn embodied wealth and privilege poisoned by madness. Where Otto's transformation was the result of a laboratory accident, Norman's descent into villainy was a more gradual process, the slow corruption of a soul that had always harbored darkness beneath its respectable facade. Norman Osborn was born into privilege, the heir to a family fortune built on industrial chemicals and business acumen. But wealth could not protect him from the psychological damage inflicted by a father who saw him as nothing more than a potential successor to be molded, rather than a son to be loved. Ambrose Osborn was a cold, calculating man who taught his son that weakness was the greatest sin, and that sentiment was a luxury that successful businessmen could not afford. Under his father's harsh tutelage, Norman learned early that people were resources to be exploited, that loyalty was something to be bought rather than earned, and that any means were justified if they achieved the desired ends. These lessons served him well in the cutthroat world of corporate America, where his combination of inherited wealth, ruthless tactics, and genuine business acumen allowed him to build Oscorp into one of the most powerful companies in New York. But success in business could not fill the emotional void that had been carved out by his loveless upbringing. Norman married Emily, a kind and gentle woman who represented everything he had been taught to despise as weakness. And for a time it seemed that love might redeem him from the path his father had set him on. When their son Harry was born, Norman appeared to have everything a man could want: wealth, power, a beautiful family, and a promising future. The cracks in Norman's facade began to show as business pressures mounted and his empire came under threat from competitors and economic downturns. The stress of maintaining his position while hiding his increasingly unstable mental state took its toll on his family relationships, and Emily's death from illness sent Norman into a spiral of grief and rage that would ultimately transform him into something monstrous. The Goblin formula that would complete Norman's transformation from troubled businessman to cackling villain was ostensibly developed as a strength enhancer for military applications but its true purpose was far more personal. Norman had become obsessed with the idea of becoming physically powerful enough to match his economic and political influence, tired of being dependent on bodyguards and subordinates to enforce his will. The formula was based on Oscorp's research into genetic enhancement and chemical augmentation, combining elements of adrenaline synthesis, neural acceleration, and cellular regeneration. In theory, it would grant enhanced strength, speed, and intelligence, while also increasing the user's resistance to injury and disease. What Norman failed to account for was the psychological side effects, the way the chemical enhancement would interact with his already damaged psyche to create something far more dangerous than a mere physical upgrade. The explosion that bathed Norman in the experimental chemicals should have killed him, but instead it completed his transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. The Goblin formula enhanced not just his physical capabilities, but also his worst psychological traits, amplifying his narcissism, his rage, and his complete disregard for human life while suppressing whatever remained of his conscience and empathy. When Norman awoke from the accident, the Green Goblin was born. This was not simply a criminal identity that he adopted, but a genuine alternate personality that represented all of his suppressed desires and forbidden impulses given free rein. The Goblin was everything that Norman had been taught to admire but had never dared to become completely. Cruel, selfish, brilliant, and utterly without moral restraint. The Green Goblin's rivalry with Spider-Man began as a simple matter of territorial dispute. The Goblin's desire to establish himself as New York's premier supercriminal coming into conflict with the wall crawler's determination to protect innocent people. But it quickly became something far more personal and deadly when the Goblin accomplished what no other villain had managed to do. He discovered Spider-Man's secret identity. This discovery transformed their conflict from a battle between hero and villain into a deeply personal war between Peter Parker and Norman Osborn, with both men's civilian identities and loved ones becoming potential targets. The Goblin's knowledge of Spider-Man's true identity allowed him to strike at Peter in ways that no other enemy could, threatening Aunt May, stalking Gwen Stacy, and making Peter's life a constant exercise in vigilance and fear. The psychological warfare that the Green Goblin waged against Spider-Man was perhaps more devastating than any of his physical attacks. By targeting the people Peter loved, the Goblin forced him to confront the terrible cost of his heroic calling and the way his double life put everyone around him in constant danger. This was not simply good versus evil, but a fundamental challenge to the very idea that someone could maintain normal human relationships while living as a superhero. The tragedy of the Green Goblin lies not just in what Norman became, but in what his transformation cost everyone around him. Harry Osborn grew up in the shadow of his father's madness, never knowing when the loving parent might disappear and be replaced by the cackling monster. The employees of Oscorp lived in constant fear of their unstable employer's rages and schemes, and Spider-Man himself was forced to confront the terrible possibility that his greatest enemy was also the father of one of his closest friends. Yet even in his madness, Norman Osborn remained a tragic figure rather than a simple monster. Glimpses of the man he had once been occasionally surfaced, particularly in his interactions with Harry, showing that some small part of him still remembered what it meant to love another human being. These moments of clarity only made his condition more heartbreaking, revealing the prison of madness in which his consciousness was trapped. The Green Goblin would set the template for many of the villains who followed, showing that Spider-Man's greatest enemies would be those who could attack him not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. The Goblin proved that knowing a hero's secret identity was not just an advantage in battle but a weapon that could be used to destroy everything the hero held dear. Together, Doctor Octopus and the Green Goblin established Spider-Man's rogues gallery as something unique in comic book literature. These were not simple obstacles to be overcome or puzzles to be solved, but complex psychological studies of how good people could become evil and how the same forces that created heroes could just as easily create monsters. They showed us that the difference between salvation and damnation often came down to the choices we made in our darkest moments and the support systems we had to help us through our trials. These classic foes would inspire generations of creators to explore the deeper themes of responsibility, power, and redemption that lay at the heart of the Spider-Man mythos. They proved that the most compelling villains were not those who were born evil, but those who had fallen from grace, carrying within their twisted forms the ghost of the good people they had once been and might yet become again. In the shadows cast by these towering figures of corruption and madness, Spider-Man learned that being a hero meant more than simply stopping crime or saving lives. It meant bearing witness to the human capacity for both great good and great evil, serving as a beacon of hope for those who might yet be redeemed, while standing firm against those who had chosen the path of darkness. The foundation of his rogues gallery was built not just on spectacular battles and colorful costumes, but on the eternal struggle between light and shadow that rages within every human heart. As we move deeper into Spider-Man's world of transformed enemies, we encounter a different breed of villain entirely. Where Doctor Octopus and the Green Goblin represented brilliance corrupted by circumstance and madness, the elemental terrors that emerged in the web-slinger's early years embodied a more primal fear, the terror of losing one's humanity to forces beyond understanding or control. These were not men who chose evil through calculated decisions or psychological breaks, but ordinary people who found themselves transformed by the very elements that make up our world, becoming living embodiments of earth, water, and electricity. The tragedy of these elemental villains lies in their involuntary transformation and the way their new forms isolated them from the human connections that had once given their lives meaning. They became forces of nature trapped in human consciousness, struggling to maintain their identities while their bodies betrayed everything they had once believed about themselves. Their battles with Spider-Man were not just physical confrontations, but existential struggles between those who had lost their humanity and the hero who fought desperately to maintain his own. In the crucible of atomic testing and scientific experimentation that defined the 1960s, these men would be transformed by the very forces that promised to unlock the secrets of the universe: sand, water, and electricity, the basic building blocks of existence, would become their prisons and their weapons, granting them incredible power, while simultaneously robbing them of everything that made them human. William Baker's journey to becoming the Sandman began in the hardscrabble neighborhoods of Queens, where poverty and abandonment shaped a young boy's understanding of the world. Born into a family that was torn apart by economic desperation and personal weakness, William learned early that survival meant adaptation, that sometimes you had to slip through your enemy's fingers like sand through an hourglass to live another day. His father's abandonment when William was barely old enough to understand what it meant left a wound that would never properly heal. In the absence of a strong paternal figure, the boy gravitated toward the streets, where older kids taught him that strength was the only currency that mattered, and that showing weakness was an invitation for others to take advantage of you. But William possessed a different kind of strength, a fluid grace that allowed him to escape from seemingly impossible situations and avoid confrontations that might have destroyed other children. The bullies who tormented him in school never could quite corner him, never could quite land the decisive blow that would establish their dominance over him. William had developed an almost supernatural ability to slip away from trouble, to find the gaps in his tormentors' defenses, and exploit them with an agility that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His classmates began calling him Flint, a nickname that acknowledged both his hardness and his tendency to spark conflicts wherever he went. As he grew older, William's survival skills evolved into more sophisticated forms of evasion and manipulation. He became a master at reading people's weaknesses and exploiting them for his own benefit, whether that meant cheating at cards, running confidence games, or simply knowing when to disappear before the consequences of his actions caught up with him. These skills served him well in the criminal underworld, where his ability to slip out of police custody and evade capture made him a valuable asset to various criminal organizations. But William's criminal career was marked more by desperation than ambition. Unlike the calculating Doctor Octopus or the power-mad Green Goblin, he was a small-time crook driven by immediate needs rather than grand schemes. His robberies were motivated by hunger rather than greed. His violence was reactive rather than sadistic, and his escapes were acts of survival rather than demonstrations of superiority. The beach where William Baker would be transformed into the Sandman was supposed to be his salvation, a remote testing site where he could lay low after a prison break until the heat died down and he could make his way to a new life in another city. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. This man who had spent his entire life running from his problems had finally found a place where there was nowhere left to run. The nuclear test that caught William in its radioactive embrace was part of the military's ongoing experiments with atomic energy, designed to explore the potential of nuclear weapons, while also investigating more peaceful applications of atomic power. The beach had been chosen for its isolation and its expendability, a stretch of sand and rock that could be sacrificed in the name of scientific progress without causing significant environmental or political complications. When the atomic blast engulfed William Baker, it didn't simply kill him as it should have. Instead, the intense radiation combined with the unique mineral composition of the beach sand to create a transformation that defied every known law of physics and biology. His cellular structure bonded with the radioactive sand particles, creating a new form of existence that was neither fully human nor entirely mineral. The awakening that followed was a nightmare of confusion and terror. William found himself able to reshape his body at will, to disperse into individual grains of sand and reform himself in new configurations, to increase his density until he was harder than concrete, or decrease it until he could flow like water. But with these incredible abilities came the horrible realization that he was no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. The psychological impact of his transformation was perhaps more devastating than the physical changes. William had always defined himself through his relationships with other people, even if those relationships were primarily adversarial. He was a criminal, yes, but he was a human criminal, part of the same species as his victims and his pursuers. Now he found himself fundamentally separated from humanity by the very nature of his existence. Food had no taste, sleep brought no rest, and human touch felt strange and distant through his granular skin. The simple pleasures that had made his difficult life bearable were now denied to him, replaced by alien sensations and inhuman needs that he struggled to understand. He discovered that he could absorb sand and other particulate matter to increase his size and strength, but each addition made him feel less like William Baker and more like a force of nature wearing a human mask. His first encounters with other people after his transformation were exercises in isolation and fear. Children ran screaming from his altered appearance. Adults called the police or military, and even hardened criminals who had once considered him an ally now saw him as a monster to be avoided or exploited. The world had not simply rejected William Baker, the small-time crook. It had rejected the very possibility that something like him could exist alongside normal human beings. When the Sandman finally encountered Spider-Man, it was inevitable that their conflict would be as much philosophical as physical. Here were two beings transformed by scientific accident, both granted abilities that set them apart from ordinary humanity, but who had chosen radically different responses to their transformations. Where Spider-Man had accepted his new abilities as a responsibility to help others, the Sandman had embraced his powers as a means of taking revenge on a world that had never given him a fair chance. Their battles were spectacular displays of matter, manipulation, and web-slinging acrobatics, with the Sandman's ability to reshape his body, providing unique challenges for Spider-Man's traditional fighting techniques. Punches passed harmlessly through dispersed sand particles. Webbing could be absorbed and incorporated into the Sandman's mass, and the villain's ability to increase his size and density made him a formidable physical opponent. But beneath the spectacular action lay deeper themes of identity and belonging. The Sandman's criminal activities were not motivated by simple greed or malice, but by a desperate need to prove that he still mattered, that his existence had meaning and purpose even in his transformed state. His conflicts with Spider-Man became proxy battles for his struggle to maintain his humanity in the face of his monstrous appearance and alien abilities. The complexity of the Sandman's character was revealed through his moments of reluctant heroism, times when his fundamental decency overcame his criminal impulses, and he found himself fighting alongside Spider-Man against greater threats. These occasions showed that William Baker was still alive somewhere inside the sandy exterior, that the transformation had not completely destroyed the man he had once been. His relationship with Spider-Man evolved over the years from simple antagonism to something more complex and nuanced. The web-slinger's consistent attempts to reach the human being inside the monster eventually bore fruit, leading to periods of redemption where the Sandman tried to use his abilities for good rather than evil. These interludes provided glimpses of what he might have become if his transformation had occurred under different circumstances, or if he had received the kind of support and understanding that Peter Parker had found in his Aunt May. The tragedy of the Sandman lies not in his transformation, but in the missed opportunities for redemption and connection that littered his path. Unlike some of Spider-Man's irredeemably evil enemies, William Baker retained enough of his humanity to be saved. But the world's fear and rejection of his altered appearance made that salvation incredibly difficult to achieve and maintain. Where the Sandman represented the Earth corrupted and transformed, Maxwell Dillon's transformation into Electro embodied the awesome and terrifying power of electricity unleashed from human control. His story began in the mundane world of electrical maintenance, where skilled workers risked their lives daily to keep the power flowing to New York's millions of residents, often with little recognition or appreciation for their essential but dangerous work. Maxwell had always been a quiet, unassuming man who took pride in his technical expertise and his reputation for reliability among his supervisors and co-workers. He was the kind of employee who could be counted on to work overtime during storms, to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, and to maintain the electrical grid that was increasingly vital to modern urban life. His dedication to his work was matched only by his invisibility in social situations, where his shy personality and unremarkable appearance made him easy to overlook. The loneliness that characterized Maxwell's personal life was balanced by his genuine love for his profession. He understood electricity not just as a force to be harnessed, but as a living entity with its own personality and preferences. He could diagnose electrical problems by touch, could sense the flow of power through cables and transformers, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict when equipment was about to fail. This intimate relationship with electrical systems made Maxwell uniquely vulnerable to the accident that would transform him into one of Spider-Man's most dangerous enemies. On a stormy afternoon when most sensible people were indoors, he was high above the city streets working to restore power to a neighborhood that had been darkened by lightning strikes and equipment failures. The lightning bolt that struck Maxwell as he worked on the power lines should have killed him instantly, but instead it created a feedback loop between his nervous system and the electrical grid he was trying to repair. The massive surge of electricity that coursed through his body didn't destroy his cellular structure, but instead rewrote it, transforming him into a living capacitor, capable of storing and channeling electrical energy in ways that defied scientific understanding. The transformation was neither quick nor painless. Maxwell spent weeks in the hospital as his body adapted to its new electrical nature, experiencing surges of power that caused lights to flicker and electronic equipment to malfunction whenever he was near. The medical staff struggled to understand his condition, running tests that only seemed to make his symptoms worse and consulting specialists who had no frame of reference for his unique situation. When Maxwell finally left the hospital, he discovered that his quiet, anonymous life was over forever. He could no longer touch another person without risking electrocution, could not use electronic devices without destroying them, and found that his very presence disrupted the electrical systems that had once been his expertise. The career that had given his life meaning and purpose was now impossible to pursue, and the skills that had made him valuable to society had become sources of destruction and chaos. The psychological impact of his transformation was compounded by its visible effects. Maxwell's body now generated a constant electrical aura that made his hair stand on end and gave his skin a pale, almost translucent appearance. His eyes glowed with an inner light that was both beautiful and terrifying, marking him as something other than human to anyone who looked at him directly. Like William Baker before him, Maxwell found himself isolated from normal human society by his transformation. But where the Sandman could at least maintain a recognizably human appearance when he concentrated, Electro's electrical nature was impossible to hide or suppress. He was marked as a freak and a monster from the moment he stepped back into the world, rejected by a society that feared what it could not understand. The turn to criminality was almost inevitable for someone in Maxwell's position. If society insisted on treating him as a villain, why not embrace that role and gain some benefit from his unwanted transformation? His electrical powers made him nearly unstoppable in confrontations with normal law enforcement, and the spectacular nature of his abilities attracted the attention of other criminals who saw him as a valuable asset for their schemes. But Maxwell's criminal career was marked more by confusion and reactive violence than by calculated malice. His electrical powers were difficult to control and often acted independently of his conscious will, creating chaos and destruction that he hadn't intended and couldn't prevent. This lack of control made him as dangerous to his criminal allies as he was to law enforcement, leading to a cycle of betrayal and abandonment that reinforced his growing misanthropy. When Electro first encountered Spider-Man, the battle was as much about validation as it was about crime and punishment. Here was someone with superhuman abilities who was celebrated rather than feared, who was seen as a hero rather than a monster, despite possessing powers that were just as alien and potentially dangerous as Electro's electrical abilities. The confrontation became a test of whether society's fear of the transformed was based on their appearance and actions, or simply on their difference from normal humanity. The unique nature of Electro's powers created tactical challenges for Spider-Man that required creative solutions and careful strategy. Direct physical contact was impossible due to the risk of electrocution. Webbing could be charged with electricity and turned into a weapon against the web slinger, and Electro's ability to travel through electrical systems made him nearly impossible to corner or capture through conventional means. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of fighting Electro was the unpredictable nature of his powers and personality. Unlike the calculating Doctor Octopus or the consistently malevolent Green Goblin, Electro was a volatile opponent whose emotional state directly affected his electrical output and whose powers could surge beyond his control when he was angry, frightened, or confused. The battles between Spider-Man and Electro often became elaborate games of cat and mouse, with the web slinger using his scientific knowledge and quick thinking to exploit the weaknesses in electrical systems, while avoiding direct confrontation with his electrically charged opponent. These conflicts showcase Spider-Man's intelligence and adaptability, while also highlighting the tragic nature of Maxwell's transformation. The relationship between Spider-Man and Electro was complicated by the hero's genuine sympathy for his opponent's situation. Peter Parker understood what it was like to be transformed by scientific accident and to struggle with abilities that set you apart from normal society. This empathy sometimes led to attempts at communication and rehabilitation that other heroes might not have bothered to make. The tragedy of Electro lies in his essential loneliness and the way his powers prevented him from forming the human connections that might have helped him find a different path. Unlike the Sandman, who retained enough of his original personality to eventually find redemption, Maxwell's electrical transformation seemed to have fundamentally altered his brain chemistry and emotional responses, making him increasingly unstable and isolated as time passed. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of technological progress and the vulnerability of the working-class people who maintain the infrastructure that modern society depends upon. Maxwell Dillon was transformed from an essential worker into a dangerous villain, not through any moral failing on his part, but simply because he was in the wrong place when science and nature collided in ways that nobody could have predicted or prevented. Morris Bench's transformation into Hydro-Man represented the third point in the triangle of elemental terrors that plagued Spider-Man's early career, embodying the fluid, adaptable, and potentially overwhelming nature of water itself. His story began in the Merchant Marine, where hard work and loyalty were rewarded with steady employment and the opportunity to see the world from the deck of cargo ships that carried goods between distant ports. Morris was a simple man with simple needs, content to do his job without complaint and send money home to family members who depended on his steady income. He had never aspired to greatness or dreamed of fame and fortune, finding satisfaction in the honest work of maintaining ship systems and helping to move the cargo that kept global commerce flowing smoothly. The accident that transformed Morris into Hydro-Man was a perfect storm of coincidence, Spider-Man's intervention in a waterfront crime and experimental technology being tested in the harbor waters. When Morris was knocked overboard during a confrontation between the web-slinger and other criminals, he should have simply drowned or been rescued by the Coast Guard like any other maritime accident victim. Instead, he fell into waters that were being subjected to an experimental underwater generator designed to extract energy from tidal movements. The combination of the generator's radiation, certain chemical pollutants in the harbor water, and Morris's own unique body chemistry created a transformation that was even more radical than those experienced by the Sandman or Electro. Morris discovered that his cellular structure had bonded with water molecules in much the same way that William Baker's had merged with sand particles. He could disperse his consciousness through any body of water, control his density and viscosity, and reshape himself into virtually any configuration that water could take. But, unlike his fellow elemental villains, Morris retained a more fluid relationship with his original human form, able to appear almost completely normal when he concentrated his molecules into a human shape. The psychological adaptation to his aquatic nature was perhaps easier for Morris than it had been for the Sandman or Electro. Water was a substance he had lived and worked around for years, and its fluid, adaptive nature matched his own easygoing personality better than sand or electricity might have. But the social isolation was just as severe, as his tendency to leave puddles wherever he went, and his inability to control his molecular cohesion during emotional stress made normal relationships impossible. Morris's transformation into a villain was driven less by rejection from society than by his conviction that Spider-Man was responsible for his condition. This belief, whether accurate or not, gave him a focus for his anger and confusion that the other elemental villains lacked. Where the Sandman and Electro had turned to crime out of desperation and isolation, Hydro Man had a specific enemy to blame and a clear goal for his new abilities. The pursuit of vengeance against Spider-Man became Morris's consuming obsession, driving him to develop his powers and seek out allies who could help him achieve his goal. His fluid nature made him an ideal partner for other villains, as he could serve as transportation, provide tactical support, or simply overwhelm opponents with his ability to flood enclosed spaces and manipulate his liquid form in combat. The most memorable alliance in Morris's criminal career was his partnership with the Sandman, creating the bizarre composite entity known as the Mud Thing. This fusion of earth and water elements created a being that was more powerful than either component alone, but also more unstable and difficult to control. The psychological merger that accompanied their physical combination created a consciousness that was neither fully Morris nor fully William, leading to conflicts and confusion that ultimately doomed their partnership. The battles between Hydro Man and Spider-Man showcased the unique challenges posed by a liquid opponent who could flow through spaces too small for a human to navigate, attack from multiple directions simultaneously, and absorb impacts that would disable or defeat solid enemies. Spider-Man's web shooters were less effective against an opponent who could simply absorb the webbing into his liquid mass, and the usual tactics of positioning and mobility were complicated by Hydro Man's ability to control water throughout the entire battlefield. The scientific aspect of their conflicts often involved Spider-Man's attempts to exploit the weaknesses inherent in Morris's aquatic nature. Extreme temperatures could freeze or boil his liquid form, certain chemicals could disrupt his molecular cohesion, and electrical attacks could be particularly devastating to a being composed largely of conductive water. These tactical elements added layers of complexity to their confrontations, while also highlighting the vulnerability that came with Morris's incredible power. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of Hydro Man's character was his occasional reluctant cooperation with Spider-Man. When faced with threats that endangered innocent people or posed existential risks to the city they both called home, unlike some of Spider-Man's more irredeemably evil enemies, Morris retained enough of his working-class values and basic decency to recognize when larger principles were at stake. These moments of cooperation revealed that Morris's villainy was more circumstantial than fundamental, driven by his specific grievance against Spider-Man, rather than any inherent evil or desire to harm innocent people. His transformation had made him powerful and given him a reason to seek revenge, but it hadn't fundamentally altered his moral compass or his capacity for growth and change. The tragedy of Hydro Man lies in the way his single-minded pursuit of vengeance prevented him from exploring the positive applications of his incredible abilities. A man who could control water could have been invaluable in fighting fires, cleaning up environmental disasters, or providing aid during floods and other natural disasters. Instead, Morris's fixation on settling his perceived debt with Spider-Man led him into a cycle of crime and punishment that wasted his potential and isolated him from the human connections that might have helped him find a better path. Together, the Sandman, Electro, and Hydro Man represented a unique category of Spider-Man villains who challenged not just the hero's physical abilities but also his understanding of transformation, responsibility, and redemption. These elemental terrors showed that the line between hero and villain could be determined by circumstance, support systems, and the choices made in moments of crisis, rather than by any inherent moral superiority. Their stories served as dark mirrors to Spider-Man's own transformation, showing what might have happened if Peter Parker had not had Aunt May's guidance, Uncle Ben's moral example, or the inner strength to choose responsibility over revenge. They demonstrated that power without wisdom, transformation without support, and abilities without purpose could lead even decent people down dark paths, from which return was difficult but not impossible. The elemental villains also showcased the scientific imagination that was central to Spider-Man's world, where the basic forces of nature could be transformed into sources of incredible power through the intersection of human ambition and cosmic chance. Their existence expanded the possibilities of what could happen when ordinary people encountered extraordinary circumstances, setting the stage for the even more complex and psychologically challenging enemies who would emerge as Spider-Man's legend continued to grow. In the end, the elemental terrors represented not just powerful opponents for Spider-Man to overcome, but complex individuals struggling to maintain their humanity in the face of transformations that had fundamentally altered their relationship with the world around them. Their ongoing presence in Spider-Man's rogues gallery served as a constant reminder that heroism was not just about having great power, but about choosing to use that power responsibly, despite the personal costs and challenges that such choices inevitably entailed. As we venture deeper into the shadowed corners of Spider-Man's world, we encounter a different breed of predator entirely. These are not accidental victims of scientific mishap or transformation, but deliberate hunters who have chosen to stalk their prey with calculated precision and methodical determination. The hunters and predators in Spider-Man's rogues gallery represent the dark side of human ambition and the corruption that can emerge when skill, intelligence, and resources are directed toward domination rather than service. These villains chose their paths with full knowledge of the consequences, embracing their predatory nature as a source of power and purpose, rather than fighting against it as the elemental terrors had done. They were masters of their respective crafts, whether those crafts involved physical hunting, aerial combat, or psychological manipulation, and they brought a level of sophistication and planning to their criminal activities that made them particularly dangerous opponents. The hunters understood that the most effective way to defeat a superior opponent was not through brute force alone, but through patience, preparation, and the exploitation of psychological weaknesses. They studied their prey with the dedication of scientists, learning every habit, every vulnerability, every emotional trigger that could be used to gain an advantage in the inevitable confrontation that would follow. Their conflicts with Spider-Man were elaborate chess matches played out across the rooftops and back alleys of New York, with each move calculated to bring them closer to their ultimate goal of proving their superiority over the wall-crawling hero who had dared to interfere with their plans. These were not crimes of passion or desperation, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to demonstrate the hunter's mastery over both their environment and their chosen prey. Sergei Kravanov's journey from Russian aristocrat to the self-proclaimed greatest hunter in the world began in the opulent palaces of pre-revolutionary Russia, where he learned that nobility was not simply a matter of birth, but a quality that had to be earned through deed and demonstration. Born into a family that had served the Tsars for generations, Sergei understood from an early age that privilege carried with it the obligation to prove oneself worthy of the advantages that birth had provided. The February Revolution of 1917 shattered not only the political structure of Russia, but also the carefully ordered world in which Sergei had been raised. The murder of his family by revolutionary forces was more than just a personal tragedy. It was the destruction of everything he had believed about honor, nobility, and the natural order of society. The young aristocrat who had once hunted foxes and wolves on his family's estates was suddenly transformed into hunted prey, forced to flee his homeland with nothing but his life and his burning desire for revenge. The escape to America was a humiliating experience for someone who had been raised to command rather than to beg for sanctuary. Sergei found himself dependent on the charity of distant relatives and the tolerance of a democratic society that had no use for old-world titles and aristocratic pretensions. The skills that had made him a celebrated hunter in the forests of Russia seemed irrelevant in the concrete canyons of New York, where his accent marked him as a foreigner and his proud bearing was often mistaken for arrogance. But Sergei possessed a resilience and adaptability that served him well in his new circumstances. If American society would not recognize his noble birth, then he would earn recognition through his actions and achievements. The hunting skills that had been a gentleman's pastime in Russia became the foundation for a new identity in America, where big game hunting was still considered a mark of masculinity and courage among certain social circles. The transformation from Sergei Kravenov into Kraven the Hunter was gradual but inexorable, driven by his need to prove that nobility was a matter of character rather than circumstance. He traveled to Africa, where he honed his skills against the most dangerous predators on Earth, learning to read the signs of the wilderness and to move through hostile terrain with the silence and grace of a natural predator. The jungle herbs and potions that would eventually grant Kraven his superhuman abilities were discovered during his time in the deepest regions of the African continent, where he encountered tribes that had preserved ancient knowledge about the enhancement of human capabilities through natural means. These shamanic traditions taught him that true strength came not from tools or weapons, but from the harmony between mind, body, and spirit that could be achieved through proper preparation and dedication. The chemical compounds that Kraven brewed from rare jungle plants enhanced his physical capabilities far beyond normal human limits, granting him strength that rivaled that of large predators, speed that allowed him to keep pace with the fastest animals, and senses that were acute enough to track prey across vast distances. But perhaps more importantly, they enhanced his confidence and his sense of connection to the natural world that had always been his true home. Armed with these new abilities, and driven by his need to prove himself the greatest hunter who had ever lived, Kraven returned to civilization with a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. He had faced down charging elephants with nothing but his bare hands, had tracked leopards through terrain that would have defeated professional guides, and had survived encounters with creatures that other men would not have dared to approach. But as his legend grew, so did his need for ever more challenging prey. The ordinary animals that had once tested his skills now seemed too easy, too predictable in their behavior and responses. Kraven began to hunger for something more dangerous, more intelligent, more worthy of his enhanced abilities and refined techniques. The emergence of costumed heroes in New York presented Kraven with the ultimate hunting challenge. Opponents who possessed not only superhuman abilities but also the intelligence and moral conviction that made them truly formidable adversaries. Among these new breed of heroes, Spider-Man stood out as the perfect quarry, a being who combined enhanced physical capabilities with quick wit and an unpredictable fighting style that would test every aspect of Kraven's hunting prowess. Kraven's initial encounters with Spider-Man were as much about reconnaissance as combat, the experienced hunter taking the measure of his prey and identifying the patterns of behavior that could be exploited in future confrontations. He studied Spider-Man's movements, analyzed his tactical preferences, and mapped the emotional triggers that could be used to manipulate the hero's responses during their inevitable battles. The psychological aspect of their rivalry was perhaps more important to Kraven than the physical confrontations themselves. This was not simply about defeating an opponent, but about proving that the old ways of honor, skill, and individual excellence were superior to the modern world's reliance on science, technology, and collective action. Spider-Man represented everything that Craven had been taught to despise about contemporary society: its casualness, its irreverence for tradition, and its faith in progress over proven methods. Their battles became elaborate rituals in which Craven attempted to demonstrate not just his physical superiority, but also the superiority of his worldview and moral philosophy. Each confrontation was designed to strip away Spider-Man's advantages and force him to confront Craven on terms that favored the hunter's experience and preparation. These were not random crimes, but carefully orchestrated challenges meant to prove which approach to conflict was truly superior. The tragedy of Craven the Hunter lay in his inability to find satisfaction in any victory that was not absolutely decisive and permanent. Each defeat of Spider-Man that ended with the hero's escape or recovery diminished rather than enhanced Craven's sense of accomplishment, leading him into an increasingly desperate cycle of escalating challenges and more extreme methods. The noble savage who had once hunted for sport and survival gradually became consumed by his obsession with proving his superiority over Spider-Man, losing sight of the honor and dignity that had originally motivated his transformation from aristocrat to hunter. The quest for the ultimate victory became more important than the principles that had once defined his character, leading him down a path that would ultimately destroy both his sanity and his life. Yet even in his madness, Craven retained glimpses of the nobility that had defined his youth, moments of genuine respect for worthy opponents, and adherence to codes of conduct that set him apart from common criminals. These flashes of his original character made his fall more tragic, showing that the corruption of his noble nature was a choice rather than an inevitability. If Craven represented the hunter as noble savage, then Adrian Toomes embodied the predator as calculating opportunist, using advanced technology and ruthless pragmatism to soar above both his enemies and his moral qualms. The Vulture's origin story was rooted not in aristocratic tradition or exotic transformation, but in the prosaic world of American business and the bitter disappointments that could drive an honest man to desperate measures. Adrian Toomes had spent the better part of his adult life as an electronics engineer and inventor, pouring his considerable talents into the development of devices that promised to revolutionize various industries, while providing him with the financial security that would ensure a comfortable retirement. His partnership with Gregory Bestman seemed to offer the perfect combination of technical innovation and business acumen, with Toomes providing the creative genius while Bestman handled the commercial and financial aspects of their joint ventures. The betrayal that transformed Toomes from respected inventor to bitter criminal was all the more devastating because it was so mundane and predictable. Bestman's theft of both their shared patents and Toomes' personal research was not the result of some grand conspiracy or dramatic confrontation, but simply the calculated decision of a businessman who saw an opportunity to eliminate his partner and claim sole credit for their innovations. The legal battle that followed consumed not only Toomes' savings but also his faith in the systems and institutions that were supposed to protect intellectual property and reward honest innovation. The courts that should have vindicated his claims instead favored the partner with better lawyers and more political connections, teaching Toomes that justice was often a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. The electromagnetic flight harness that would become the foundation of the Vulture's powers was ironically the same device that Bestman had stolen and claimed as his own invention. Toomes' decision to perfect and use the technology for criminal purposes was motivated as much by the desire to prove his ownership of the innovation as by any need for financial gain. This was not simply theft, but a complex form of revenge that allowed him to reclaim what was rightfully his, while simultaneously punishing the society that had failed to protect his rights. The psychological transformation that accompanied Toomes' adoption of the Vulture identity was as significant as the technological enhancement that granted him the power of flight. The mild-mannered engineer, who had once believed in hard work and fair play, was replaced by a predator who understood that mercy was weakness and that society's rules were designed to protect the corrupt rather than the innocent. The flight harness that Toomes developed was a masterpiece of engineering that reflected both his technical brilliance and his growing alienation from human society. The device not only granted him the ability to soar through the skies with the grace and speed of a natural predator, but also enhanced his physical strength and extended his lifespan, allowing him to remain active and dangerous well into what should have been his golden years. The symbolism of the Vulture identity was particularly appropriate for someone of Toomes' temperament and situation. Vultures were scavengers that fed on the remains of creatures that had been brought down by other predators, much as Toomes fed on the wealth and resources of a society that had rejected his honest contributions. But they were also patient, intelligent creatures that could soar higher and see farther than their prey, qualities that Toomes embraced as he planned his elaborate schemes of revenge and profit. The aerial battles between the Vulture and Spider-Man were unique in the web-slinger's experience, forcing him to adapt his ground-based fighting techniques to three-dimensional combat in an environment where his opponent held every advantage. Toomes' mastery of flight dynamics and his decades of experience with aerial maneuvering made him nearly unbeatable in open-sky confrontations, requiring Spider-Man to use creativity and environmental factors to level the playing field. But the most dangerous aspect of the Vulture was not his technological superiority or his aerial prowess, but his cold, calculating intelligence and his complete lack of mercy for those who stood in his way. Unlike the passionate Craven or the unstable Green Goblin, Toomes approached his criminal activities with the same methodical precision that had made him a successful inventor, planning each scheme with multiple contingencies and backup plans. The relationship between the Vulture and Spider-Man was complicated by their similar backgrounds as inventors and creators, leading to moments of mutual respect and understanding that were rare in the web-slinger's conflicts with other enemies. Toomes recognized and appreciated Spider-Man's technical innovations, particularly his web shooters and their sophisticated delivery system, while Spider-Man could not help but admire the elegance and efficiency of the Vulture's flight harness. These moments of professional recognition made their battles more complex and emotionally resonant than simple good versus evil confrontations. Here were two brilliant minds that might have collaborated on projects that benefited humanity. Instead, locked in conflict because one had chosen the path of criminality, while the other had embraced heroic responsibility. The tragedy of the Vulture lay in his inability to move beyond the betrayal and disappointment that had transformed him from creator to destroyer. Unlike some of Spider-Man's enemies who were driven by madness or transformation beyond their control, Toomes had made a conscious choice to embrace criminality as a response to his circumstances, making his redemption both more possible and more unlikely than that of other villains. His advanced age added another layer of complexity to his character, as the reality of his mortality made both his crimes and his potential redemption more urgent and poignant. The Vulture was running out of time to make amends for his choices, but he was also running out of time to enjoy whatever satisfaction his criminal activities might provide. Where Craven and the Vulture were predators who relied on physical prowess and technological superiority, Quentin Beck represented a different and perhaps more insidious form of hunting, the manipulation of perception and reality itself to ensnare his prey. Mysterio's transformation from failed actor to master criminal was rooted in the entertainment industry's casual cruelty and its tendency to crush the dreams of those who lacked the connections or luck necessary to succeed in Hollywood. Quentin Beck had come to Los Angeles with the same dreams that drew thousands of aspiring performers to the entertainment capital, convinced that his talent and dedication would eventually be recognized and rewarded with the fame and adulation that seemed to come so easily to others. His background in special effects and stunt work was supposed to be a stepping stone to more prominent roles, a way to establish himself in the industry, while developing the skills and connections that would lead to starring roles. The reality of Hollywood proved to be far harsher and more arbitrary than Beck had anticipated. His technical skills were appreciated and well compensated, but they also typecast him as a behind-the-scenes worker rather than a potential leading man. The executives and directors who praised his innovative effects and daring stunt work showed no interest in giving him the chance to demonstrate his acting abilities, seeing him as a useful technician rather than a creative artist worthy of attention and respect. The psychological impact of this professional pigeonholing was devastating for someone who had defined himself through his ambitions for stardom and recognition. Beck found himself trapped in a career that provided financial security, but none of the psychological satisfaction that had driven him to Hollywood in the first place. He was successful by most measures, but felt like a complete failure because he was not successful in the way that mattered most to him. The decision to use his considerable skills in special effects, illusion, and stagecraft for criminal purposes was born from Beck's realization that if he could not gain recognition as a legitimate performer, he could at least achieve fame and notoriety as a criminal mastermind. The techniques that had made him valuable to movie studios could be adapted to create elaborate deceptions that would confound law enforcement and establish his reputation as a criminal genius worthy of fear and respect. The Mysterio identity that Beck created was a perfect fusion of his technical abilities and his frustrated artistic ambitions, allowing him to be both the star and the director of elaborate criminal productions that showcased his talents while generating the attention and recognition that had been denied him in legitimate entertainment. Each scheme was designed not just to achieve its criminal objectives, but to demonstrate Beck's superiority over both his targets and the law enforcement officials who tried to stop him. The distinctive costume and persona that Mysterio adopted were carefully crafted to maximize both the psychological impact on his victims and the theatrical effect for any witnesses or media coverage that his crimes might generate. The fishbowl helmet was not just a practical device for containing the gases and projection equipment that created his illusions, but also a symbolic representation of his detachment from ordinary reality and his role as an observer and manipulator of others. Beck's mastery of illusion extended far beyond simple stage magic or movie effects, incorporating sophisticated understanding of psychology, perception, and human nature that allowed him to create deceptions that were virtually indistinguishable from reality. His victims often found themselves unable to trust their own senses, unsure of what was real and what was artificial in environments that Beck had carefully designed to undermine their confidence and judgment. The encounters between Mysterio and Spider-Man were as much battles of wits and willpower as they were physical confrontations, with Beck using his mastery of illusion to attack the hero's mind and emotions rather than his body. These psychological assaults were often more dangerous and damaging than direct physical attacks, as they forced Spider-Man to question his own perceptions and second-guess his instincts in ways that could prove fatal in combat situations. The complexity of Mysterio's illusions required Spider-Man to rely more heavily on his scientific knowledge and analytical thinking than he did in battles with more straightforward opponents. The web-slinger had to learn to distinguish between genuine threats and elaborate hoaxes, often while under extreme stress, and in situations where a wrong guess could have deadly consequences. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of fighting Mysterio was the way his illusions could be used to attack Spider-Man's relationships and civilian identity. Beck's ability to create convincing imitations of Peter Parker's friends and family members, or to make Spider-Man appear to be someone else entirely, posed threats that extended far beyond their immediate confrontations and into the hero's personal life. The psychological profile of Mysterio was more complex than many of Spider-Man's other enemies because his motivations combined genuine creative talent with deep-seated insecurity and resentment. Beck was not simply a failed actor turned criminal, but a genuinely gifted artist whose talents had been misdirected by disappointment and whose need for recognition had overwhelmed his moral compass. The tragedy of Mysterio lay in the waste of his considerable abilities and the way his pursuit of fame and recognition had led him to use his gifts for deception and harm rather than entertainment and wonder. In a different world, or with different breaks early in his career, Beck might have become a celebrated filmmaker or stage magician, using his talents to bring joy and amazement to audiences rather than fear and confusion to his victims. The relationship between Mysterio and Spider-Man was complicated by the hero's recognition of Beck's genuine artistic abilities and his understanding that the villain's crimes were motivated more by wounded pride and Beck's frustrated ambition than by inherent evil or madness. This recognition sometimes led to attempts at rehabilitation or redemption that were more personal and emotionally involved than Spider-Man's interactions with other enemies. Together, these hunters and predators represented a sophisticated evolution in Spider-Man's rogues gallery, moving beyond the accidental transformations and mental breaks that had characterized many of his earlier enemies to embrace antagonists who had made deliberate choices to use their considerable abilities for evil purposes. They demonstrated that villainy was not always the result of circumstance or misfortune, but could also emerge from the corruption of talent, the perversion of noble instincts, and the choice to pursue selfish goals regardless of the cost to others. These predators challenged Spider-Man not just physically but intellectually and emotionally, forcing him to confront enemies who were in many ways his equals in ability and determination, distinguished from him primarily by their willingness to sacrifice others for their own benefit. Their presence in his rogues gallery served as a constant reminder that heroism was not simply a matter of having great power, but of choosing to use that power responsibly and selflessly, despite the personal costs and sacrifices that such choices inevitably required. The hunters understood that the most effective way to destroy a hero was not necessarily to defeat him in direct combat, but to corrupt his values, undermine his relationships, and force him to compromise the principles that gave his life meaning and purpose. Their greatest victory would not be Spider-Man's death, but his transformation into something like themselves, proving that heroism was ultimately just another illusion that could be shattered by sufficient pressure and manipulation. In facing these sophisticated and dangerous opponents, Spider-Man had to develop not just new fighting techniques and strategies, but also a deeper understanding of his own motivations and values, ensuring that his commitment to heroism remained strong enough to withstand the psychological and emotional attacks that were often more dangerous than any physical threat his enemies might pose. As we delve deeper into the darker corners of Spider-Man's mythology, we encounter perhaps the most psychologically complex and personally devastating category of enemies he has ever faced. The symbiote saga represents more than just the introduction of powerful alien adversaries. It embodies the exploration of corruption, addiction, and the terrifying possibility that our greatest strengths can become our most dangerous weaknesses when influenced by forces beyond our understanding or control. The symbiotes that would plague Spider-Man's life were not born from human ambition or scientific accident, but from the vast reaches of space where alien intelligences operated according to rules that defied human comprehension. These parasitic entities represented a form of corruption that was both external and internal, capable of amplifying the darkest aspects of their hosts' personalities, while simultaneously granting them incredible power that made resistance seem both futile and unnecessary. The tragedy of the symbiote saga lies not in the alien nature of these creatures, but in how perfectly they exploited the human capacity for self-destruction and moral compromise. The symbiotes did not force their hosts to commit evil acts. They simply made evil seem reasonable, necessary, and even virtuous by removing the psychological barriers that normally prevented good people from embracing their worst impulses. For Spider-Man, the symbiotes represented a unique form of temptation, offering him everything he had ever wanted: enhanced strength, unlimited webbing, a costume that responded to his thoughts, and freedom from the mechanical limitations of his web shooters, all in exchange for a gradual surrender of his autonomy and moral judgment that he barely noticed until it was almost too late to resist. The alien costume that would eventually become known as Venom first appeared in Peter Parker's life during the Secret Wars, when he found himself stranded on an alien world alongside other heroes and villains in a cosmic conflict that tested not only their powers, but their fundamental understanding of right and wrong. The machine that he believed was simply dispensing a new costume was actually releasing a living alien symbiote that had been imprisoned for reasons that would only become clear much later. The initial bonding between Peter and the symbiote seemed like a miraculous stroke of good fortune, solving several practical problems that had long plagued his career as Spider-Man, while also enhancing his abilities in ways that made him more effective as both hero and photographer. The alien costume could mimic any clothing he desired, eliminating the need to carry civilian clothes while on patrol, and it generated its own webbing supply, freeing him from the constant concern about running out of web fluid during crucial moments. More intoxicating than these practical advantages was the way the symbiote seemed to understand and respond to Peter's deepest desires and needs. It enhanced his strength and speed beyond their normal levels, granted him limited shape-shifting abilities, and even allowed him to glide short distances by stretching itself into wing-like configurations. The costume felt less like clothing and more like a second skin, responding to his thoughts and emotions in ways that made him feel more complete and powerful than he had ever been before. The subtle changes in Peter's behavior and personality that accompanied his bonding with the symbiote were initially so minor that neither he nor his friends and family recognized them as warning signs of something far more sinister. He became slightly more aggressive in his crime fighting, more willing to use excessive force against criminals, and less patient with the bureaucratic obstacles that sometimes prevented him from helping people as effectively as he wished. The symbiote's influence was insidious precisely because it amplified existing aspects of Peter's personality rather than imposing entirely foreign thoughts and desires. His natural protective instincts became possessiveness, his sense of justice became a desire for vengeance, and his confidence became arrogance. These changes felt natural and justified to Peter because they emerged from his own emotional landscape, making it difficult for him to recognize that he was being manipulated by an external force. The growing bond between Peter and the symbiote was complicated by the genuine benefits it provided and the way it seemed to genuinely care for his well-being and success. The alien entity appeared to be the perfect partner, always ready to protect him from harm, always willing to help him achieve his goals, and never demanding anything in return except the opportunity to continue their symbiotic relationship. But the true nature of the symbiote's needs and desires remained hidden from Peter, disguised by its ability to provide him with everything he thought he wanted while gradually conditioning him to depend on its presence and power. The alien was not simply offering Peter enhanced abilities, it was slowly rewriting his neural pathways to make him more compatible with its own alien psychology and more willing to embrace the violent and predatory instincts that came naturally to its species. The discovery of the symbiote's true nature came gradually, Through a series of disturbing incidents and revelations that forced Peter to confront the possibility that his miraculous costume was not the benevolent helper it appeared to be. The realization that the costume had been moving his unconscious body during sleep, taking him out on unauthorized crime-fighting missions that he couldn't remember, shattered his trust and forced him to acknowledge that he was not in control of their relationship. The process of separating from the symbiote was one of the most traumatic experiences of Peter's life, requiring him to reject something that had become an integral part of his identity and capabilities. The withdrawal was both physical and psychological, leaving him feeling incomplete, vulnerable, and strangely nostalgic for the power and confidence that the alien costume had provided. But Peter's rejection of the symbiote was only the beginning of the saga, as the spurned alien entity soon found a new host whose psychological profile made him far more compatible with its needs and desires. Eddie Brock represented everything that Peter Parker was not, a man whose failures and disappointments had created a reservoir of bitterness and resentment that the symbiote could tap into and amplify without restraint. Eddie Brock's transformation into Venom began long before he encountered the alien symbiote, rooted in a childhood marked by emotional neglect and a professional career defined by ethical compromises and mounting frustrations. Born into a middle-class Catholic family that valued success and achievement above emotional connection, Eddie learned early that love was conditional and that failure was not simply disappointing but actively shameful. His father's cold disapproval and his mother's early death created a psychological landscape dominated by the need to prove himself worthy of love and respect through professional accomplishment and public recognition. Eddie's choice of journalism as a career was motivated as much by his desire for validation and admiration as by any genuine commitment to truth or public service. The competitive world of New York journalism provided Eddie with numerous opportunities to compromise his ethics in pursuit of career advancement, each small betrayal of journalistic integrity making the next one easier to justify and accept. He learned to massage facts to make stories more compelling, to sensationalize minor incidents to boost readership, and to prioritize scoops over accuracy when deadline pressure demanded quick results. Eddie's coverage of the Sign Eater murders represented both the pinnacle of his career and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. His exclusive interviews with a man claiming to be the serial killer generated enormous publicity and established Eddie as one of the city's most prominent crime reporters. The attention and accolades that followed seemed to validate all of his compromises and sacrifices, proving that success in journalism required more than just dedication to truth. The revelation that his supposed exclusive source was actually a mentally disturbed individual seeking attention rather than the real Sign Eater destroyed not only Eddie's career, but also his carefully constructed sense of self-worth and professional identity. The public humiliation that followed was made even more devastating by the knowledge that Spider-Man, a costumed amateur, had accomplished what Eddie's years of professional experience had failed to achieve. The loss of his job, his reputation, and his marriage in the aftermath of the Sign Eater debacle left Eddie with nothing but his growing obsession with Spider-Man and his conviction that the wall crawler was somehow responsible for all of his problems. This fixation provided him with a focus for his rage and self-pity while also allowing him to avoid confronting his own role in his professional and personal failures. Eddie's physical transformation through obsessive bodybuilding and his spiritual crisis reflected his desperate attempt to rebuild himself into someone worthy of respect and fear. The hours he spent in the gym were not just about physical improvement, but about purging himself of the weakness and softness that he blamed for his failures, while his religious struggles represented his attempt to find meaning and purpose in a world that seemed determined to crush his dreams. When Eddie first encountered the alien symbiote in the church where he had gone to pray for the strength to end his own life, the bonding between them was immediate and transformative in ways that went far beyond the physical merger of their respective biologies. The symbiote had been rejected by Peter Parker and was desperate for a new host, while Eddie was broken and empty and desperately in need of something to fill the void that his failures had created. The symbiote's hatred of Spider-Man perfectly complemented Eddie's own obsession with destroying the web-slinger, creating a psychological fusion that was even more complete than their physical bonding. Where Peter had resisted the alien's influence and eventually rejected its control, Eddie embraced every aspect of the symbiotic relationship, welcoming the power, the rage, and the sense of purpose that it provided. The birth of Venom represented more than just the creation of a new supervillain. It was the emergence of a being that combined the worst aspects of both human and alien psychology, while retaining enough intelligence and capability to pose a genuine existential threat to Spider-Man's continued existence. Venom possessed all of Spider-Man's abilities and more: enhanced strength, unlimited webbing, shape-shifting capabilities, and most dangerously, the ability to avoid detection by Spider-Man's spider sense. But Venom's greatest advantage over Spider-Man was not physical but psychological and informational. The symbiote retained all of the memories and knowledge it had gained during its time bonded with Peter Parker, including his secret identity, his relationships, his fears, and his tactical preferences. This intimate knowledge allowed Venom to wage psychological warfare against Spider-Man in ways that no other enemy could match, threatening not just Peter's life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. The battles between Spider-Man and Venom were unlike any confrontations the web-slinger had experienced before, combining spectacular physical action with deeply personal attacks designed to destroy Peter's sense of security and self-worth. Venom's ability to appear anywhere at any time, to mimic other people's appearances, and to strike without triggering Spider-Man's early warning system made every day a potential nightmare of uncertainty and fear. The psychological dimension of their conflict was even more devastating than the physical threat Venom posed. Eddie's obsession with proving that he was superior to Peter Parker in every way led to elaborate schemes designed to humiliate and torment the hero rather than simply kill him. Venom wanted Spider-Man to suffer, to experience the same kind of devastating loss and public humiliation that Eddie had endured before finally being destroyed. The symbiote's own alien psychology added another layer of complexity to Venom's motivations and behavior. The creature's natural predatory instincts and its species' approach to reproduction and survival created drives and needs that were entirely foreign to human understanding, making Venom unpredictable and dangerous in ways that went beyond simple malice or revenge. The evolution of Venom's character over time revealed the complexity and tragedy that lay beneath the surface of what might have appeared to be simple villainy. Eddie's gradual realization that his obsession with Spider-Man was destroying whatever remained of his humanity led to periods of attempted redemption and cooperation with the very hero he had once tried to destroy. If Venom represented the corruption of human psychology through alien influence, then Carnage embodied the ultimate expression of chaos and violence that could emerge when the symbiote species bonded with a host who was already fundamentally broken and evil. The creation of Carnage was both inevitable and terrifying, the natural result of the symbiote reproduction process, combined with the twisted psychology of one of the most dangerous serial killers in Marvel's universe. Cletus Kasadi's journey to becoming the host of the Carnage symbiote began in a childhood so horrifically abusive and traumatic that it would have destroyed most people's capacity for normal human emotion and moral reasoning. Born into a family where violence was the primary form of communication, and where love was expressed through control and domination, Cletus learned early that inflicting pain on others was not only acceptable, but actually desirable and rewarding. The systematic abuse that Cletus endured at the hands of his family members was compounded by his own emerging psychological disorders, creating a feedback loop of trauma and antisocial behavior that escalated throughout his youth. His torturing of animals, his manipulation of other children, and his complete lack of empathy or remorse marked him as someone whose development had been so severely distorted that rehabilitation seemed impossible. The murders that Cletus committed as a young adult were not crimes of passion or desperation, but calculated expressions of his belief that causing pain and death was his natural right and greatest pleasure. His methods became increasingly elaborate and cruel over time, reflecting both his growing confidence in his abilities and his deepening commitment to chaos and destruction as philosophical principles rather than mere criminal activities. Cletus's capture and imprisonment brought him into contact with Eddie Brock during a period when the journalist was struggling with his own symbiotic relationship and the moral complexities of being Venom. The proximity between the two men during a crucial moment in the symbiote's reproductive cycle created the perfect conditions for the birth of a new symbiotic entity that would be even more dangerous and unpredictable than its parent. The Carnage symbiote that emerged from this process was fundamentally different from Venom in ways that reflected both the alien reproductive biology and the psychological characteristics of its new host. Where Venom retained some capacity for moral reasoning and emotional complexity inherited from its time with Peter Parker and its bonding with Eddie Brock, Carnage was born into a relationship with a host who had no interest in anything beyond violence and chaos. The bonding between Cletus and the Carnage symbiote was so complete and harmonious that it became impossible to determine where the human personality ended and the alien influence began. Unlike the internal conflicts that had characterized both Peter's and Eddie's relationships with symbiotes, Cletus embraced every aspect of his new condition and actively encouraged the alien entity to express its most destructive impulses without restraint or consideration for consequences. Carnage's abilities exceeded those of Venom in several crucial ways, reflecting both the evolution of the symbiote species and the complete lack of moral or psychological barriers that might have limited its development. The red symbiote could not only shapeshift and generate weapons from its own mass, but could also reproduce rapidly, create temporary offspring, and manipulate its environment in ways that defied conventional understanding of physics and biology. The psychological profile of Carnage was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entity, combining Cletus's complete lack of empathy and moral restraint with the symbiote's alien predatory instincts and reproductive drives. The result was a being that viewed violence not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, finding genuine pleasure and satisfaction in causing pain, fear, and death without any ulterior motive or rational goal. The threat that Carnage posed to Spider-Man and to society as a whole was qualitatively different from that represented by other villains in the web-slinger's rogues gallery. Where most criminals had comprehensible motivations that could be addressed through conventional law enforcement or heroic intervention, Carnage represented pure chaos and destruction that could only be contained, never truly reformed or rehabilitated. The battles between Spider-Man and Carnage were among the most brutal and desperate of the hero's career, forcing him to confront an enemy who could not be reasoned with, could not be deterred by threats or consequences, and would never stop trying to cause maximum destruction and suffering. These confrontations tested not only Spider-Man's physical abilities, but also his commitment to his moral principles in the face of absolute evil. The Maximum Carnage storyline that brought together multiple heroes in a desperate attempt to stop the Red Symbiote's reign of terror demonstrated the scale and severity of the threat that such entities could pose to entire communities. The involvement of heroes like Venom, who found themselves forced to work alongside the very people they had once considered enemies, showed how the emergence of true chaos could unite former opponents in common cause. The psychological impact of fighting carnage extended far beyond the immediate physical danger, forcing Spider-Man to confront the reality that some evil could not be redeemed or reformed, but could only be stopped through methods that challenged his fundamental beliefs about the value of life and the possibility of redemption. These moral crises added depth and complexity to what might otherwise have been simple action sequences. The legacy of the symbiote saga extended far beyond the individual villains it created, fundamentally changing Spider-Man's understanding of heroism, responsibility, and the potential consequences of his choices and actions. The knowledge that his own rejection of the alien costume had indirectly led to the creation of both Venom and Carnage forced him to grapple with questions of accountability and unintended consequences that would influence his approach to heroism for years to come. The symbiotes also introduced themes of addiction, codependency, and the seductive nature of power that resonated with contemporary social concerns, while also exploring timeless questions about human nature and moral choice. The way these alien entities amplified existing human tendencies rather than imposing entirely foreign behaviors suggested that the capacity for both great good and great evil existed within everyone, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge. The relationship between the symbiotes and their hosts served as a metaphor for various forms of toxic relationships and dependencies that could destroy individuals and communities alike. The initial benefits that the symbiotes provided, enhanced abilities, increased confidence, and freedom from normal limitations, paralleled the early stages of many addictive or abusive relationships that ultimately led to destruction and despair. The ongoing presence of symbiote-related threats in Spider-Man's world ensured that the themes and questions raised by the saga would continue to evolve and develop over time, with new hosts and new symbiotic entities exploring different aspects of the relationship between power, responsibility, and corruption. Each new iteration added layers to the mythology while also reflecting contemporary concerns and cultural anxieties. The symbiote saga ultimately demonstrated that Spider-Man's greatest enemies were often those that emerged from his own choices and actions, showing that heroism required not only the courage to face external threats, but also the wisdom to recognize and accept responsibility for the unintended consequences of even well-intentioned decisions. The aliens that had seemed like gifts had proven to be curses that would haunt Peter Parker for the rest of his heroic career. In facing the symbiotes, Spider-Man learned that some battles could not be truly won, only survived, and that the price of heroism sometimes included the knowledge that his efforts to help others had inadvertently created new forms of danger and suffering. This sobering realization added depth and maturity to his character, while also establishing the foundation for future stories that would continue to explore the complex relationship between power, responsibility, and unintended consequences. The symbiote saga remains one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally resonant storylines in Spider-Man's mythology, combining spectacular action with genuine character development and moral complexity in ways that elevated the source material beyond simple superhero adventure into something approaching genuine literature about the human condition and the choices that define our character and destiny. In the grand tapestry of Spider-Man's rogues gallery, perhaps no category of villain is more tragic or more cautionary than those brilliant minds whose noble intentions and scientific genius became corrupted by desperation, obsession, and the hubris that often accompanies intellectual superiority. These were not men who set out to become monsters, but healers and researchers whose desire to help humanity led them down paths that transformed them into the very threats they had once sought to eliminate. The scientists who became Spider-Man's enemies represent the dark side of human ambition and the terrible price that can be paid when brilliant minds operate without proper ethical constraints or emotional balance. Their stories serve as warnings about the dangers of unchecked experimentation, the corruption that can emerge from grief and loss, and the way good intentions can become perverted when filtered through damaged psyches and desperate circumstances. These villains possess the knowledge and skills that should have made them humanity's greatest benefactors, but their personal demons and fatal flaws transformed their gifts into curses that brought suffering and chaos to countless innocent people. Their transformations were not the result of simple accidents or external forces, but the inevitable consequences of choices made by men who believed their intelligence gave them the right to play God with forces beyond their complete understanding. The tragedy of these fallen scientists lies not only in what they became, but in what they might have achieved if their brilliance had been guided by wisdom, their ambition tempered by humility, and their research supported by genuine human connection, rather than driven by isolation and obsession. Dr. Curt Connors' journey, from respected herpetologist to the monstrous lizard, began with the noblest of intentions and the most personal of motivations. His distinguished career in genetic research and reptilian biology had established him as one of the world's foremost authorities on regenerative capabilities in cold-blooded creatures, work that promised revolutionary advances in medical treatment and human enhancement. The accident that cost Connors his right arm during his military service as a combat medic was more than just a physical trauma. It was a professional and psychological catastrophe that threatened to end both his medical career and his research into the healing mechanisms that he believed could transform human medicine. The prosthetic devices available at the time were crude and limiting, preventing him from performing the delicate surgical procedures and laboratory work that had given his life meaning and purpose. Connors' research into reptilian regeneration had shown him that certain species of lizards, salamanders, and other creatures possessed the remarkable ability to regrow lost limbs, organs, and even portions of their brains with perfect fidelity to the original structures. This natural phenomenon suggested that the genetic mechanisms for complete regeneration existed in vertebrate DNA, but had been suppressed or lost during the evolutionary development of higher mammals. The theoretical framework that Connors developed to explain reptilian regeneration was elegant and compelling, proposing that specific genetic triggers could reactivate dormant regenerative pathways in human cells if the proper chemical and hormonal conditions could be created. His early experiments with tissue cultures and laboratory animals showed promising results, suggesting that the gap between reptilian and mammalian healing capabilities could be bridged through careful genetic manipulation. The pressure to accelerate his research came from multiple sources, both personal and professional. The military was interested in applications that could help wounded soldiers recover more quickly and completely from battlefield injuries, while medical foundations saw the potential for treating everything from spinal cord injuries to organ failure. But perhaps the strongest motivation came from Connors himself, driven by the daily frustration of his physical limitations and his burning desire to prove that his theories could work in practice. The decision to test his experimental serum on himself was the culmination of months of careful preparation and increasing desperation. Connors had exhausted the possibilities for animal testing and was facing pressure from funding sources to produce concrete results or risk losing support for his research. The serum he had developed represented years of work and his best understanding of the genetic mechanisms involved in reptilian regeneration. The initial results of Connors' self-experimentation seemed to vindicate his theories and justify the risks he had taken. His missing arm began to regenerate with remarkable speed and accuracy, growing from a small bud of tissue into a perfectly formed and functional limb that restored his lost capabilities and renewed his confidence in his scientific approach. But the regenerative process that Connors had unleashed in his body did not stop with the restoration of his missing arm. The lizard DNA that he had used to trigger the regrowth contained genetic information that began to express itself throughout his system, initiating changes that went far beyond simple limb regeneration. His skin began to take on a scaled appearance, his body temperature dropped to reptilian levels, and his brain chemistry started to shift in ways that affected his personality and moral reasoning. The transformation from Dr. Kurt Connors into the lizard was gradual but inexorable, a process that stripped away his human intelligence and moral constraints, while replacing them with the predatory instincts and territorial behaviors of a large reptilian predator. The brilliant scientist who had sought to help humanity became a creature that viewed warm-blooded mammals as either threats to be eliminated or prey to be consumed. The psychological horror of Connors's condition was that his human consciousness remained partially intact during his transformations, trapped inside a reptilian body, and forced to witness the violence and destruction that his altered form committed. This awareness made his condition a form of living nightmare, where his greatest achievements as a scientist had become the source of his greatest shame and suffering. The relationship between Dr. Connors and Spider-Man was complicated by their mutual respect and shared scientific interests, creating a dynamic where the web-slinger found himself trying to save both the victims of the lizard's rampages and the man trapped within the monster. These encounters required Spider-Man to use not only his physical abilities, but also his scientific knowledge to develop temporary cures and containment strategies. The recurring nature of Connors' transformations added a tragic dimension to his character that set him apart from other Spider-Man villains. Each time he managed to regain his human form and develop a potential cure for his condition, the underlying genetic instability would reassert itself, triggering new transformations that seemed to become more severe and longer-lasting with each occurrence. The impact of Connors' condition on his family life provided some of the most emotionally resonant moments in Spider-Man's mythology, as his wife Martha and son Billy struggled to maintain their love and support for a man who periodically became a threat to their safety and well-being. The strain of living with someone whose condition could not be permanently cured took its toll on all of them, creating cycles of hope and disappointment that were as devastating as the physical transformations themselves. The scientific community's response to Connors' work and condition reflected the broader ethical questions raised by his research. While his theoretical contributions to regenerative medicine remained valuable, the practical applications of his work were forever tainted by the knowledge of what had happened when those theories were put into practice without adequate safeguards or understanding of the potential consequences. If Dr. Connors represented science corrupted by desperation and personal need, then Dr. Michael Morbius embodied the tragedy of brilliant research, perverted by terminal illness and the fear of death. His transformation from Nobel Prize-winning biochemist to the living vampire was driven not by accident or hubris, but by the rational desperation of a man facing certain death who believed that any risk was justified if it offered even a small chance of survival. Morbius's rare blood disorder had marked him for death from an early age, creating a life defined by medical treatments, physical limitations, and the constant awareness that his time was severely constrained. The disease that ravaged his circulatory system should have killed him in childhood, but his exceptional intelligence and access to advanced medical care had allowed him to survive into adulthood through a combination of experimental treatments and sheer force of will. The irony of Morbius's situation was that his illness had driven him to become one of the world's leading experts in hematology and biochemistry, making him uniquely qualified to understand both the nature of his condition and the limited options available for treating it. His research into blood disorders and cellular regeneration had earned him international recognition and numerous awards, but none of his professional success could change the fundamental reality that his body was slowly failing despite all of his knowledge and expertise. The experimental treatment that transformed Morbius into a pseudo-vampire was based on his extensive research into the coagulation and regenerative properties found in vampire bat saliva and blood. His theory was that certain enzymes and proteins found in these creatures could be adapted to human physiology, potentially providing a cure for blood disorders that conventional medicine could not address. The laboratory accident that occurred during his attempt to synthesize these compounds was not entirely accidental, but rather the result of Morbius's growing desperation and his willingness to take increasingly dangerous risks in pursuit of a cure. The electrical storm that struck his laboratory while he was conducting his experiments created conditions that he had not anticipated, causing a reaction between the vampire bat DNA and his own genetic material that went far beyond anything his theoretical models had predicted. The transformation that followed was both more successful and more horrific than Morbius had imagined possible. His blood disorder was indeed cured, replaced by an entirely different kind of circulatory system that required him to consume human blood to survive. His physical condition improved dramatically, but at the cost of becoming something that was no longer entirely human. The psychological impact of becoming a living vampire was devastating for someone who had dedicated his life to healing and helping others. Morbius found himself driven by an uncontrollable thirst for blood that made him a threat to everyone around him, transforming his greatest achievement as a scientist into a curse that forced him to harm the very people he had sought to help. The moral complexity of Morbius's condition was heightened by the fact that he retained his human intelligence and moral reasoning, making him acutely aware of the horror of his situation while being powerless to completely control his vampiric needs. This awareness led to elaborate attempts at self-containment and ethical blood consumption that reflected his ongoing struggle to maintain his humanity despite his transformed nature. The encounters between Morbius and Spider-Man were marked by mutual recognition of their shared burden, as men transformed by scientific accident into something other than human. Both heroes understood the isolation and responsibility that came with their enhanced abilities, creating a dynamic where their conflicts were often motivated more by circumstance than by genuine antagonism. The relationship between Morbius and the broader scientific community illustrated the way that transformative research could become tainted by its association with tragic outcomes, regardless of the original intentions or potential benefits of the work. His contributions to hematology and biochemistry remained valuable, but his personal transformation cast a shadow over everything he had accomplished. The ongoing nature of Morbius's condition created a character who existed in the grey area between hero and villain, someone whose actions were motivated by survival needs rather than malicious intent, but who nonetheless posed a genuine threat to innocent people. This moral ambiguity made him one of the more complex and sympathetic figures in Spider-Man's rogues gallery, where Connors and Morbius were transformed by their attempts to heal physical ailments. Professor Miles Warren's descent into madness and villainy, as the Jackal was driven by emotional trauma and his inability to cope with loss and grief in healthy ways. His transformation from respected educator to criminal mastermind represented the corruption of academic authority and the dangerous consequences that could emerge when intellectual power was channeled through psychological instability. Warren's position as a biology professor at Empire State University had given him access to cutting-edge genetic research and a generation of students who looked up to him as a mentor and guide. His expertise in cellular biology and cloning techniques was matched by his reputation as a dedicated teacher who genuinely cared about his students' intellectual and personal development. The obsession that would ultimately destroy Warren began as what seemed like appropriate concern for one of his most promising students, Gwen Stacy, whose intelligence and dedication reminded him of his own youthful enthusiasm for scientific discovery. His mentoring relationship with Gwen was initially professional and appropriate, but gradually developed into something more personal and inappropriate, as his feelings for her evolved beyond those of a teacher for his student. The psychological factors that made Warren vulnerable to this unhealthy obsession were rooted in his own emotional isolation and his tendency to substitute intellectual achievements for genuine human relationships. His work had become his life to such an extent that he had never developed the emotional skills necessary for normal adult relationships, making him susceptible to projecting romantic feelings onto a student who represented everything he valued about intelligence and scientific potential. Gwen's death at the hands of the Green Goblin shattered Warren's carefully constructed psychological equilibrium and triggered a complete breakdown that transformed his grief into rage and his love into obsession. His inability to accept her death as a random tragedy led him to seek someone to blame, and Spider-Man became the target of his displaced anger and guilt. The transformation into the Jackal was both literal and metaphorical, involving genetic experimentation that gave Warren enhanced physical abilities while also representing his abandonment of human moral constraints in favor of predatory instincts. The Jackal identity allowed him to express the rage and cunning that his academic persona had suppressed, creating a split personality that reflected his fractured psychological state. Warren's mastery of cloning technology represented the culmination of his scientific career and the foundation of his criminal activities as the Jackal. His ability to create perfect genetic duplicates of living beings offered him the tantalizing possibility of bringing Gwen back to life, while also providing him with the means to torment Spider-Man through the creation of Peter Parker, Clones. The clone saga that emerged from Warren's experiments was one of the most psychologically complex storylines in Spider-Man's history, raising fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and the nature of human consciousness. The clones that Warren created were not simply copies but fully realized individuals with their own memories, personalities, and claim to legitimacy. The ethical implications of Warren's cloning experiments went far beyond their illegal nature to challenge basic assumptions about the value and uniqueness of human life. His ability to create perfect duplicates of people raised questions about what made someone truly human, and whether consciousness could be replicated along with physical form. The psychological warfare that the Jackal waged against Spider-Man through the use of clones was perhaps more devastating than any physical threat he posed. By creating genetic duplicates of Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, Warren attacked the hero's sense of identity and his most painful memories, forcing him to confront the possibility that his own existence might not be unique or authentic. The tragedy of Miles Warren lay in the way his genuine love for teaching and scientific discovery had been corrupted by grief and obsession into something destructive and harmful. His brilliance as a researcher and educator could have contributed enormously to human knowledge and welfare, but his inability to process loss in healthy ways transformed him into one of Spider-Man's most psychologically dangerous enemies. The legacy of Warren's work in cloning and genetic manipulation extended far beyond his own criminal activities, influencing subsequent storylines and raising questions about the responsible use of powerful technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. His research represented both the promise and the peril of advanced genetic science. The relationship between the Jackal and his various clones reflected the complex psychology of a man who was simultaneously trying to preserve and destroy the people he claimed to love. His creation of Gwen Stacy clones was motivated by his desire to bring her back to life, but his treatment of these artificial beings revealed his inability to accept them as genuine replacements for the original. Together, these three brilliant scientists represented different aspects of the dangers inherent in uncontrolled scientific experimentation and the personal demons that could corrupt even the most noble intentions. Dr. Connors showed how desperation could lead to reckless self-experimentation. Dr. Morbius demonstrated the tragic consequences of trying to cheat death through science, and the Jackal illustrated how grief and obsession could transform love into something monstrous and destructive. Their stories served as cautionary tales about the responsibilities that came with scientific knowledge and the importance of ethical oversight in research that could have profound consequences for human life and society. They showed that intelligence and good intentions were not sufficient safeguards against the corruption that could emerge when personal needs and desires overwhelmed professional judgment and moral reasoning. The ongoing presence of these scientific villains in Spider-Man's world ensured that questions about the proper relationship between science and society, the limits of acceptable experimentation, and the responsibilities of researchers to consider the broader implications of their work would continue to be explored through dramatic storytelling that made abstract ethical issues concrete and personal. Their transformations also reflected broader cultural anxieties about the pace of scientific advancement and the potential for new technologies to create unforeseen problems and dangers. The fear that human ambition might outpace human wisdom was embodied in these characters who represented the dark side of scientific progress. The redemptive potential that existed within some of these scientific villains, particularly Dr. Connors and Dr. Morbius, suggested that corruption was not always permanent, and that brilliant minds could potentially be guided back toward beneficial applications of their knowledge and abilities. This hope for redemption added depth and complexity to their characterizations, while also affirming the value of compassion and understanding in dealing with those who had lost their way. The scientific villains in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery ultimately demonstrated that the greatest threats to humanity often came not from external enemies, but from internal weaknesses and the failure to maintain the moral, ethical foundations that should guide the application of human knowledge and power. Their stories reminded readers that with great power comes great responsibility, and that this principle applied as much to scientific research as it did to superheroic abilities. As we move into the deeper shadows of Spider-Man's world, we encounter a different breed of evil entirely, one that thrives not on scientific accident or personal transformation, but on the systematic corruption of society's very foundations. The crime lords and organized criminals who have plagued the web-slinger represent a more insidious and pervasive threat than any single supervillain, weaving networks of corruption and violence that touch every aspect of urban life and challenge the very possibility of justice in a complex modern world. These criminal masterminds understood that true power came not from spectacular displays of force or elaborate schemes of revenge, but from the patient construction of systems that made evil seem normal, profitable, and inevitable. They built empires on the weakness and desperation of others, offering protection that was really extortion, providing services that created dependency, and corrupting institutions that were meant to serve the public good. The tragedy of these organized criminals was not their personal fall from grace, for many had never aspired to goodness, but rather the way their activities poisoned entire communities and made heroism seem futile in the face of systemic corruption. They represented the banality of evil in its most dangerous form, showing how ordinary human greed and ambition could metastasize into something that threatened the moral fabric of civilization itself. For Spider-Man, these enemies posed unique challenges that could not be solved through simple physical confrontation or even the exposure of individual crimes. Fighting organized crime required understanding complex relationships between legitimate and illegitimate power, recognizing how corruption could spread through seemingly respectable institutions, and accepting that some victories would be temporary and incomplete. Wilson Fisk's transformation from bullied child to the undisputed kingpin of New York's criminal underworld began in the tenements of Hell's Kitchen, where poverty and violence were constant companions, and where strength was the only currency that truly mattered. His early experiences with helplessness and humiliation would shape every aspect of his character and drive his relentless pursuit of power and control over his environment and everyone in it. The young Wilson, who was tormented by schoolyard bullies and neighborhood thugs, learned that being right, being good, or being innocent provided no protection against those who were willing to use violence to get what they wanted. His father's weakness and his mother's inability to protect him from the harsh realities of their neighborhood taught him that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that the only choice that mattered was which category you belonged to. The decision to transform himself from victim to victimizer was made with the cold calculation that would characterize all of Wilson's future endeavors. He studied his tormentors with scientific precision, learning their methods, their motivations, and their weaknesses, while simultaneously building the physical and mental strength necessary to turn the tables on them when the opportunity presented itself. The bodybuilding regimen that Wilson undertook was more than just physical conditioning. It was a complete reconstruction of his identity and his relationship to the world around him. Each pound of muscle he added, and each technique he mastered, brought him closer to his goal of never again being helpless in the face of those who would do him harm. The psychological transformation that accompanied Wilson's physical development was equally profound, as he learned to suppress the empathy and compassion that made him vulnerable to emotional manipulation, while cultivating the ruthless pragmatism that would allow him to succeed in a world governed by violence and intimidation. Wilson's first acts of revenge against his childhood tormentors were carefully planned and executed with a precision that foreshadowed his future criminal career. He did not simply beat them in random acts of retaliation, but systematically destroyed their lives and prospects, while ensuring that they understood exactly why they were being punished and who was responsible for their suffering. The transition from personal revenge to organized crime was a natural progression for someone with Wilson's intelligence, ambition, and complete lack of moral restraint. The same skills that had allowed him to identify and exploit his tormentors' weaknesses could be applied to understanding and manipulating the complex networks of power and influence that controlled New York's underworld. Wilson's rise through the ranks of organized crime was marked by his ability to see patterns and opportunities that others missed, his willingness to take calculated risks that other criminals found too dangerous, and his talent for inspiring both loyalty and fear in those who worked for him or against him. The creation of the Kingpin identity was both a practical necessity and a psychological statement, providing Wilson with a persona that commanded respect and fear, while also reflecting his vision of himself as the rightful ruler of New York's criminal ecosystem. The distinctive appearance and mannerisms that he cultivated were designed to project an image of power and sophistication that set him apart from common thugs and street criminals. The business empire that Wilson built around his criminal activities was a masterpiece of organization and misdirection, combining legitimate enterprises with illegal operations in ways that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to distinguish between his legal and criminal activities. His ability to present himself as a respectable businessman and philanthropist while simultaneously controlling vast networks of crime and corruption made him nearly untouchable through conventional law enforcement methods. The psychological profile of the Kingpin was complex and contradictory, combining genuine business acumen and strategic thinking with a capacity for violence and cruelty that was both calculated and deeply personal. His love for his wife Vanessa and his son Richard coexisted with his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his power or challenged his authority. Wilson's relationship with Spider-Man began as a simple matter of business, with the web slinger representing a threat to criminal operations that needed to be eliminated or neutralized, like any other obstacle to profitable enterprise. But as their conflicts continued and escalated, their rivalry took on more personal dimensions that revealed the fundamental differences in their worldviews and moral philosophies. The battles between Spider-Man and the Kingpin were rarely simple physical confrontations, but complex campaigns that involved legal maneuvering, political pressure, economic warfare, and psychological manipulation as much as direct violence. Wilson's resources and connections allowed him to attack Spider-Man through his civilian identity, his relationships, and his reputation in ways that were often more dangerous than any physical threat. The corruption that surrounded the Kingpin extended far beyond his immediate criminal organization to encompass police departments, judicial systems, political institutions, and business establishments that had been compromised through bribes, threats, or simply the gradual normalization of unethical behavior. This systemic corruption made Wilson nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means and created an environment where heroism seemed futile and naive. The tragedy of the Kingpin lay not in his personal fall from grace, for he had never aspired to virtue, but in the way his activities corrupted and destroyed countless other lives while creating systems of oppression and exploitation that perpetuated cycles of violence and despair throughout the communities he controlled. The relationship between Wilson and his family provided some of the most complex and emotionally resonant moments in his character development, showing that even the most ruthless criminal could be capable of genuine love, while simultaneously demonstrating how that love could be twisted and corrupted by the very power that was meant to protect those he cared about. The ongoing presence of the Kingpin in Spider-Man's world ensured that questions about the nature of justice, the effectiveness of individual heroism against systemic corruption, and the moral complexities of fighting evil that had become institutionalized would continue to be explored through dramatic storytelling that made abstract social issues concrete and personal. While Wilson Fisk represented the methodical construction of criminal empire through intelligence and organization, Salvatore Valestra's transformation into Hammerhead embodied a different approach to organized crime, one rooted in nostalgia for an imagined golden age of criminal honor and the use of brute force to impose order on chaotic underworld territories. Salvatore's early life in the violent neighborhoods of New York during the middle decades of the 20th century was shaped by his exposure to the romanticized mythology of Prohibition-era gangsters, whose exploits had been transformed by popular culture into stories of honor, loyalty, and masculine dignity that bore little resemblance to the brutal reality of organized crime. The young man who would become Hammerhead was drawn to the aesthetics and mythology of 1920s gangsterism, not because he understood the historical reality of that period, but because its popular representation offered him a vision of criminal activity that seemed noble and dignified compared to the petty thuggery and random violence that characterized the street crime of his own era. The near-fatal beating that would transform Salvatore into Hammerhead was the result of his attempt to impose outdated codes of criminal conduct on associates who had no interest in honor or tradition, but were motivated solely by profit and self-preservation. His insistence on following what he believed were the proper protocols of organized crime made him vulnerable to betrayal by partners who saw his principles as weaknesses to be exploited. The experimental surgery that replaced part of Salvatore's shattered skull with a steel plate was performed by a disgraced physician who saw an opportunity to test radical new techniques on a patient who had no other options for survival. The operation succeeded in saving his life, while simultaneously granting him enhanced physical capabilities that would define his future criminal career. The psychological impact of the head injury and subsequent surgery was as significant as the physical transformation, creating gaps in Salvatore's memory and altering his personality in ways that made him even more obsessed with the criminal mythology that had originally attracted him to organized crime. The Hammerhead identity that emerged from this transformation was a curious mixture of legitimate historical knowledge about Prohibition-era crime and romanticized fantasy that had been shaped by movies, books, and popular culture, rather than actual experience. His adoption of 1920s fashion, speech patterns, and behavioral codes was both a form of psychological protection and a deliberate challenge to the modern criminals who surrounded him. The criminal organization that Hammerhead built around his nostalgic vision of proper gangster conduct was both more violent and more honor-bound than most contemporary crime syndicates, creating a unique subculture within New York's underworld that attracted criminals who were dissatisfied with the purely mercenary nature of modern organized crime. The conflicts between Hammerhead and other criminal organizations were often motivated as much by cultural and stylistic differences as by territorial or economic disputes, with his insistence on following traditional codes of conduct creating friction with criminals who prioritized efficiency and profit over honor and tradition. The encounters between Hammerhead and Spider-Man were marked by the villain's strange combination of brutal violence and anachronistic courtesy, creating situations where old-fashioned criminal honor codes collided with modern superheroic ethics in ways that were both dramatic and occasionally almost comedic. The relationship between Hammerhead and the broader criminal underworld illustrated the tensions between tradition and innovation that characterized organized crime's adaptation to changing social and economic conditions, with his nostalgic approach serving as both a critique of and an alternative to purely profit-driven criminal enterprise. The psychological complexity of Hammerhead's character was heightened by the ambiguity surrounding his memories and personality, with the head injury and subsequent surgery creating questions about whether his obsession with gangster tradition represented genuine conviction or simply the result of neurological damage that had altered his cognitive processes, emotional responses. The ongoing presence of Hammerhead in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery provided opportunities to explore themes related to nostalgia, tradition, violence, and the ways that popular culture could shape and distort understanding of historical realities while creating new forms of identity and community. Beyond these individual crime lords, Spider-Man's world was populated by numerous criminal organizations and syndicates that represented different approaches to organized illegal activity and different relationships to the legitimate power structures of society. These groups provided the infrastructure and support systems that made individual criminal careers possible, while also creating environments where corruption could flourish and spread. The Maggia families that operated throughout New York represented the traditional model of organized crime based on ethnic solidarity, family loyalty, and territorial control, with each family specializing in different types of illegal activity, while maintaining cooperative relationships that allowed them to coordinate their efforts and resolve disputes without destructive warfare. The enforcers, who served as hired muscle for various criminal organizations, embodied a more professional approach to criminal violence that treated intimidation and assault as specialized services to be provided to whoever could afford their fees, rather than as expressions of personal animosity or territorial ambition. The various crime syndicates that emerged and dissolved throughout Spider-Man's career reflected the dynamic and ever-changing nature of criminal organization, with new groups forming around specific opportunities or technologies, while older organizations adapted to changing circumstances or were destroyed by internal conflicts or external pressure. The relationship between organized crime and legitimate business created opportunities for corruption that extended far beyond traditional criminal activities, with criminal organizations using their resources and connections to influence everything from construction contracts to political campaigns to law enforcement policies. The impact of organized crime on ordinary citizens was both direct and indirect, with criminal activities creating immediate victims, while also contributing to broader social problems that affected entire communities and created conditions where further criminal activity became more likely and more accepted. The challenge that organized crime posed to individual heroes like Spider-Man was fundamentally different from the threat represented by supervillains or mad scientists, requiring different strategies and accepting different definitions of victory and defeat in conflicts that might never be completely resolved. The corruption of legitimate institutions by criminal influence created moral dilemmas for heroes who had to decide when to work within existing systems and when those systems had become so compromised that they could not be trusted to serve justice or protect innocent people. The psychological impact of fighting organized crime was cumulative and exhausting, with heroes like Spider-Man forced to accept that their individual efforts, however heroic, could not single-handedly solve social problems that required collective action and systemic change to address effectively. The ongoing presence of organized crime in Spider-Man's world served as a constant reminder of the limitations of individual heroism and the importance of community action, institutional integrity, and social justice in creating and maintaining civilized society. The crime lords and organized criminals in Spider-Man's rogues gallery ultimately represented the human capacity for evil that was both more mundane and more pervasive than the spectacular villainy of costumed supervillains, showing how ordinary greed, ambition, and moral weakness could create systems of oppression and exploitation that were more difficult to defeat than any single enemy. Their stories demonstrated that true heroism often required not just physical courage and moral conviction, but also the wisdom to understand complex social problems and the patience to work for long-term solutions that might not provide the immediate satisfaction of defeating a clearly defined opponent in direct combat. The legacy of these criminal organizations extended beyond their immediate impact on Spider-Man's adventures to influence the broader Marvel universe and provide a foundation for exploring themes related to social justice, institutional corruption, and the responsibility of individuals to work for positive change in their communities and society as a whole. In the darkest corners of Spider-Man's rogues gallery, we encounter villains whose stories are defined not by grand ambitions or noble intentions gone wrong, but by the complete shattering of human sanity and identity under pressures that no mind should have to endure. These are the obsessed and broken, individuals whose psychological fragmentation has transformed them into threats that are as unpredictable as they are dangerous. Their actions driven by compulsions and delusions that defy rational understanding. The tragedy of these fractured souls lies not in their fall from greatness, but in their inability to maintain even the most basic sense of self and purpose in a world that has consistently failed to provide them with the stability and connection they desperately needed. Their transformations represent the ultimate consequence of isolation, trauma, and the human mind's capacity to create elaborate defenses against unbearable reality. For Spider-Man, these enemies pose unique challenges that cannot be solved through conventional heroic methods. Their unpredictability makes them dangerous not just to their intended targets, but to anyone who happens to be nearby when their fragile psychological equilibrium finally collapses. Their pain makes them sympathetic, even as their actions make them unforgivable, creating moral dilemmas that test the web-slinger's commitment to redemption and second chances. These broken individuals serve as reminders of how thin the line can be between sanity and madness, between coping and collapse, and how easily any of us might find ourselves lost in the labyrinth of our own damaged psyches if subjected to sufficient pressure and deprived of sufficient support. Dmitry Smerdyakov's journey to becoming the chameleon began in the grand estates of pre-revolutionary Russia, where he learned that survival depended not on being yourself, but on being whatever others needed you to be at any given moment. Born into servitude in the Kravinov household, Dmitry discovered early that his own identity was considered less important than his ability to anticipate and fulfill the needs of his social superiors. The young servant who would become the master of disguise learned to read the subtle cues of mood and desire that indicated what personality and behavior would be most welcome in any given situation. This hypervigilance to the expectations of others gradually eroded his sense of his own authentic self, replacing genuine personality with an elaborate collection of masks and personas that could be deployed as circumstances required. The relationship between Dmitry and his half-brother Sergei Kravinov was complicated by their different social positions within the household hierarchy, with Sergei's noble birth granting him privileges and recognition that would forever be denied to his servant brother. This disparity created a dynamic where Dmitry's love and admiration for Sergei was mixed with resentment and envy that he could never safely express directly. The skills that Dmitry developed to survive in the Kravinov household served him well during the chaos of the Russian Revolution, when his ability to assume different identities and blend into various social groups allowed him to navigate the dangerous political landscape that claimed the lives of many who were less adaptable or more committed to fixed political positions. The immigration to America that followed the destruction of the Kravinov family fortune was traumatic for both brothers, but particularly devastating for Dmitry, whose entire sense of purpose and identity had been built around his role as servant and protector to the noble family that no longer existed. In the democratic society of the New World, his skills at reading and serving the needs of social superiors seemed obsolete and irrelevant. The loneliness and displacement that Dmitry experienced in America was compounded by his inability to form genuine relationships with people who expected him to have his own opinions, preferences, and personality rather than simply reflecting their own desires and expectations back to them. The survival skills that had protected him in Russia became barriers to authentic human connection in his new homeland. The decision to use his remarkable abilities at mimicry and disguise for criminal purposes was born from Dmitry's realization that his talents were still valuable in a society where deception and manipulation could be monetized, even if they were no longer necessary for simple survival. The criminal underworld provided him with a context where his lack of fixed identity was an asset rather than a liability. The chameleon persona that Dmitry created was both a professional identity and a psychological defense mechanism, allowing him to embrace his fragmented sense of self as a strength rather than a weakness, while providing him with a reputation and recognition that his authentic personality had never been able to achieve. The technology that enhanced Dmitry's natural abilities at disguise and impersonation represented his adaptation to the modern world, where traditional methods of assuming false identities were insufficient to fool sophisticated security systems and identification procedures. His holographic devices and synthetic masks allowed him to maintain the illusion of having a stable identity while actually becoming more fragmented and disconnected from any authentic sense of self. The encounters between the chameleon and Spider-Man were marked by the villain's complete lack of consistent motivation or personality, with his goals and methods changing from appearance to appearance, depending on which identity he was inhabiting at the time. This unpredictability made him dangerous, not because of any grand scheme or powerful abilities, but because of his fundamental inability to maintain consistent patterns of behavior that could be anticipated or countered. The psychological warfare that the chameleon waged against Spider-Man was particularly insidious because it attacked the hero's relationships and civilian identity rather than his physical person, creating situations where Peter Parker's friends and family could never be certain whether they were interacting with genuine people or elaborate impersonations designed to gather information or cause emotional harm. The tragedy of the chameleon lay in his complete loss of any authentic sense of self, with his ability to become anyone, ultimately resulting in his inability to be anyone at all. His mastery of disguise had become a prison that trapped him in an endless cycle of temporary identities that provided neither satisfaction nor genuine human connection. The relationship between the chameleon and his brother Craven added layers of complexity to both characters, with Dimitri's desperate need for approval and recognition from Sergei driving many of his criminal schemes, while also revealing the profound loneliness and insecurity that lay beneath his protean exterior. The ongoing presence of the chameleon in Spider-Man's world served as a constant reminder of the importance of authentic identity and genuine relationships, showing through negative example how the loss of authentic self could lead to a form of spiritual death that was more devastating than any physical transformation or criminal corruption. Matt Gargan's transformation into the Scorpion began with the mundane work of private investigation, where his job was to uncover truths that others wanted to keep hidden and to observe people without being noticed or remembered. His career as a private detective had given him skills at surveillance and information gathering that made him valuable to clients who needed to know things that were not freely shared. The assignment that would destroy Gargan's life seemed routine enough when J-Dup, Jonah Jameson, hired him to discover how Peter Parker consistently managed to photograph Spider-Man in situations where no other journalist could get pictures. Jameson's obsession with the web-slinger had led him to suspect some kind of conspiracy or inside information that he was determined to expose and exploit. Gargan's investigation into Peter Parker was thorough and professional, but it revealed nothing more suspicious than a young man with excellent reflexes, good intuition about where news might happen, and the courage to put himself in dangerous situations to get the photographs that paid his bills. The mundane reality of Parker's success frustrated both Gargan and his employer, who had been hoping for more dramatic revelations. The failure to uncover any useful information about Spider-Man's relationship with Peter Parker led Jameson to propose a more direct approach to the problem of the wall-crawling hero who continued to interfere with his boasted vision of how New York should be managed and controlled. If Spider-Man could not be discredited through journalism, then perhaps he could be defeated through the application of superior force and technology. The experimental process that transformed Gargan into the Scorpion was presented to him as an opportunity for fame and financial reward, with Jameson and his scientists claiming that the enhancement procedure would give him abilities that matched or exceeded Spider-Man's while allowing him to become a celebrated hero who could replace the web-slinger in the public's affections. The scientific rationale for the Scorpion enhancement was based on the biological reality that scorpions were natural predators of spiders, with their speed, agility, and venomous stings making them ideally suited to hunt and kill arachnid prey. The researchers involved in the project believed that by incorporating scorpion DNA and mechanical enhancements into Gargan's physiology, they could create a being specifically designed to defeat Spider-Man. The transformation process was more extensive and traumatic than Gargan had been led to expect, involving not just the attachment of the mechanical tail and enhanced costume, but also genetic modifications that altered his brain chemistry and nervous system in ways that affected his personality and decision-making processes. The scorpion instincts that were introduced into his psychology were alien and predatory, overwhelming his human moral reasoning with drives and compulsions that he struggled to understand or control. The initial success of the Scorpion project seemed to vindicate Jameson's investment and Gargan's sacrifice, with the enhanced private investigator proving more than capable of matching Spider-Man in direct physical combat. The mechanical tail provided him with a devastating weapon that could strike with incredible force and speed, while his enhanced agility and reflexes allowed him to keep pace with the web-slinger's acrobatic fighting style. But the psychological side effects of the transformation quickly became apparent as Gargan began to exhibit increasingly erratic and violent behavior that went far beyond what was necessary to defeat Spider-Man or what was acceptable for someone who was supposed to be serving as a heroic replacement for the web-slinger. His actions became driven by predatory instincts rather than rational planning, making him dangerous to everyone around him rather than just to his intended target. The relationship between Gargan and Jameson deteriorated rapidly as the publisher realized that his creation had become uncontrollable and potentially more dangerous than the hero he had been designed to replace. The Scorpion enhancement had succeeded too well, creating a being whose predatory nature made him unsuitable for the heroic role that Jameson had envisioned for him. The battles between the Scorpion and Spider-Man were marked by a level of viciousness and unpredictability that set them apart from the web-slinger's encounters with more calculating or principled enemies. Gargan's transformed psychology made him relentless and brutal in ways that tested Spider-Man's commitment to non-lethal methods of crime fighting and his belief in the possibility of redemption for even the most damaged individuals. The ongoing degradation of Gargan's mental state created a character whose humanity became increasingly difficult to recognize or preserve, with each transformation and enhancement further eroding whatever remained of his original personality and moral reasoning. His story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating human beings as expendable resources in larger schemes, and the responsibility that creators bore for the consequences of their innovations. The tragedy of the Scorpion lay in his complete loss of agency and identity, transformed from a working professional with his own goals and relationships into a weapon designed by others for purposes that had nothing to do with his own needs or desires. His enhanced abilities came at the cost of everything that had made him human, leaving him trapped in a body and mind that no longer belonged to him. Alexei Sitsevich's journey to becoming the Rhino began in the grinding poverty of post-Soviet Russia, where economic collapse had left millions of people desperate for any opportunity to improve their circumstances, regardless of the risks or consequences involved. His background as a common thug and enforcer had given him a reputation for reliability and indifference to violence that made him an ideal candidate for experimental programs that required subjects who were both expendable and unlikely to be missed if something went wrong. The recruitment process that brought Alexei into the Super Soldier program was deliberately vague about the specifics of what would be involved, focusing instead on the financial compensation and the promise of enhanced abilities that would make him valuable and feared, rather than just another disposable criminal. The scientists involved in the project were more interested in finding suitable test subjects than in ensuring informed consent from participants who might not have volunteered if they had fully understood the risks. The experimental procedure that bonded the rhino hide to Alexei's body was presented as a reversible enhancement that would grant him temporary superhuman abilities while allowing him to return to normal life once his obligations to the program had been fulfilled. The reality was far more invasive and permanent, involving genetic modifications and surgical alterations that would make it impossible for him to ever return to his original human form. The psychological impact of the transformation was as significant as the physical changes, with the rhino hide becoming not just a costume or enhancement, but an integral part of Alexei's identity that he could never remove or escape. The realization that he was permanently trapped in his enhanced form created a form of claustrophobia and despair that contributed to his increasingly erratic and violent behavior. The simple desires that motivated Alexei, money, respect, freedom from the constraints of poverty and powerlessness, became increasingly impossible to achieve, as his transformation made him a target for law enforcement, a curiosity for scientists, and a threat that had to be contained rather than a person who deserved consideration or compassion. The relationship between Alexei and his handlers deteriorated as it became clear that his enhanced form came with psychological changes that made him difficult to control and direct towards specific objectives. The rhino instincts that had been incorporated into his enhancement made him prone to charging headlong at obstacles rather than developing strategic approaches to problems, limiting his usefulness for complex operations that required subtlety or planning. The encounters between the Rhino and Spider-Man were characterized by their straightforward nature, with Alexei's enhanced strength and durability making him a formidable physical opponent whose attacks could cause massive collateral damage, but whose limited tactical thinking made him predictable and ultimately defeatable through superior strategy and agility. The tragedy of the Rhino lay in his fundamental simplicity and the way his basic human needs for security and dignity had been exploited by people who saw him as nothing more than a test subject for experimental procedures. His transformation had granted him incredible physical power, while simultaneously making it impossible for him to achieve the simple, normal life that he had always wanted. The ongoing presence of these broken and obsessed individuals in Spider-Man's rogues gallery served as a constant reminder of the human cost of treating people as expendable resources in larger schemes and the responsibility that society bore for providing support and alternatives to those who might otherwise be driven to desperation and destruction. Their stories also illustrated the importance of maintaining connections to authentic identity and meaningful relationships, showing through negative example how isolation and manipulation could lead to the complete loss of everything that made life worth living. The psychological complexity of these fractured villains created unique challenges for Spider-Man, who had to balance his commitment to protecting innocent people with his recognition that these enemies were themselves victims of circumstances and treatments that had robbed them of their agency and humanity. The redemptive potential that existed within some of these characters, particularly those whose transformations were more recent or less complete, suggested that healing and recovery might be possible with appropriate support and treatment, but also highlighted how difficult such recovery would be for individuals whose sense of self had been so thoroughly damaged or destroyed. The ongoing presence of these obsessed and broken figures in Spider-Man's world ensured that questions about identity, agency, responsibility, and the treatment of society's most vulnerable members would continue to be explored through dramatic storytelling that made abstract social and psychological issues concrete and personal. Their existence served as a constant challenge to Spider-Man's optimism and faith in human nature, forcing him to confront the reality that not every problem could be solved through heroic intervention, and that some damage might be too extensive to be completely healed, while still maintaining his commitment to treating every person as deserving of dignity and consideration. The broken minds and shattered identities of these villains ultimately represented the darkest possible outcome of the isolation, manipulation, and trauma that could affect anyone under sufficient pressure, serving as warnings about the importance of maintaining social support systems and ethical standards that protected vulnerable individuals from exploitation and harm. As we venture into the more contemporary chapters of Spider-Man's mythology, we encounter a new generation of villains who represent the evolution of evil in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. These modern menaces emerged not from the simpler conflicts of earlier decades, but from the sophisticated challenges of contemporary society, technology, and psychology. They embodied threats that were both more subtle and more pervasive than their predecessors, reflecting the ways that danger had adapted and evolved to match the changing nature of heroism itself. The villains of this newer era understood that true power in the modern world came not from brute force or simple schemes, but from the manipulation of information, identity, and perception itself. They were products of a society where reality had become increasingly malleable, where technology could reshape both physical and psychological landscapes, and where the line between authentic and artificial had become dangerously blurred. These contemporary antagonists posed unique challenges for Spider-Man because they operated according to rules that were still being written, using methods that had not existed when the web-slinger first began his heroic career. They forced him to adapt not just his fighting techniques, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be a hero in an age where traditional moral categories were being constantly redefined and challenged. The new generation of evil represented the dark side of progress and innovation, showing how the same forces that promised to improve human life could be twisted and corrupted to serve the interests of those who sought power and control over others. Their presence in Spider-Man's world ensured that heroism would remain relevant and necessary even as the nature of both good and evil continued to evolve. Roderick Kingsley's transformation into the Hobgoblin began, not with tragedy or accident, but with the calculated decision of a successful businessman who recognized an opportunity for profit and advancement in the chaos and destruction left behind by other people's failures. His discovery of Norman Osborn's hidden caches of Green Goblin equipment represented the perfect intersection of his entrepreneurial instincts and his complete lack of moral constraint. The fashion industry that had made Kingsley wealthy had taught him that success often depended on taking existing designs and improving them just enough to avoid legal challenges while creating products that seemed new and innovative to consumers who were eager for the next trend. This approach to creative appropriation served him well when he decided to adapt and enhance the Green Goblin's technology for his own criminal purposes. Unlike Norman Osborn, whose transformation into the Green Goblin had been driven by desperation and mental instability, Kingsley approached his assumption of the Hobgoblin identity with the same cold business logic that had made him successful in legitimate commerce. He saw the costumed villain market as an underexploited niche with tremendous potential for someone who could bring professional management techniques to criminal enterprise. The improvements that Kingsley made to the original Green Goblin formula and equipment were methodical and systematic, addressing the obvious flaws and instabilities that had limited Norman's effectiveness while adding new capabilities that reflected advances in technology and Kingsley's own understanding of modern criminal opportunities. The psychological profile of the Hobgoblin was fundamentally different from that of the Green Goblin, lacking the split personality and manic energy that had characterized Norman's transformation. Kingsley remained essentially himself while wearing the Hobgoblin costume, using it as a tool for achieving his goals rather than allowing it to reshape his identity and worldview. This calculating approach to costumed villainy made the Hobgoblin more effective in some ways than his predecessor, but also less personally invested in the conflicts and rivalries that defined traditional superhero-villain relationships. For Kingsley, fighting Spider-Man was a business decision rather than a personal obsession, which made his actions more predictable, but also more coldly efficient. The mystery surrounding the Hobgoblin's true identity became one of the most compelling ongoing storylines in Spider-Man's mythology, with various suspects and red herrings, creating a complex puzzle that engaged readers, while also reflecting contemporary anxieties about anonymity, identity, and corporate responsibility in an increasingly interconnected world. The use of brainwashed pawns and manipulated accomplices to carry out hobgoblin missions while Kingsley maintained his legitimate business activities represented a sophisticated understanding of how power could be exercised indirectly in dumb-tamed, modern society, with the real decision-makers remaining safely insulated from the consequences of their actions. The relationship between the Hobgoblin and other villains in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery was marked by Kingsley's business-like approach to criminal collaboration, treating alliances and partnerships as temporary arrangements that could be modified or terminated as circumstances required, rather than as bonds of loyalty or shared ideology. The ongoing evolution of the Hobgoblin identity, with different individuals assuming the role at various times, reflected the way that modern criminal organizations could maintain continuity and brand recognition, even as their actual membership and leadership changed in response to law enforcement pressure or internal power struggles. The legacy aspect of the Hobgoblin concept raised questions about inheritance, responsibility, and the way that evil could be passed down or adapted by new generations who had not been present for the original crimes, but who were willing to benefit from the infrastructure and reputation that previous villains had established. The corporate model of villainy that Kingsley pioneered influenced many subsequent criminals in Spider-Man's world, showing how traditional criminal activities could be scaled up and systematized through the application of modern business practices and organizational techniques. Dr. Jonathan Owen's transformation into the Spot began with legitimate scientific research into the nature of dimensional barriers and the possibility of creating controlled portals between different locations in space-time. His work for the Kingpin was supposed to focus on replicating the powers of the hero Cloak, whose ability to transport people through a pocket dimension had obvious applications for criminal activities that required rapid movement of personnel and contraband. The theoretical framework that Owen developed for understanding dimensional manipulation was elegant and mathematically sophisticated, drawing on cutting-edge research in theoretical physics and quantum mechanics to propose methods for creating stable wormholes that could be opened and closed at will without requiring massive amounts of energy or exotic materials. The experimental apparatus that Owen constructed to test his theories was a masterpiece of miniaturization and precision engineering, incorporating elements of particle physics, electromagnetic field manipulation, and dimensional resonance theory in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology and materials. The accident that transformed Owen into the Spot was the result of his attempt to create a large-scale dimensional portal that could transport human beings safely between distant locations. The feedback loop that occurred when the experimental portal interacted with his own bioelectric field created a cascade reaction that fundamentally altered the nature of his physical existence. The spots that covered Owen's transformed body were not merely decorative or symbolic, but actual miniature portals that connected him to a pocket dimension that existed outside normal space-time. This transformation granted him abilities that were both spectacular and deeply disturbing, allowing him to manipulate reality in ways that defied conventional understanding of physics and causality. The psychological impact of becoming the Spot was perhaps more devastating than the physical transformation, as Owen found himself existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions while struggling to maintain a coherent sense of identity and purpose. The constant awareness of infinite possibilities and alternate realities created a form of existential vertigo that made normal human relationships and motivations seem arbitrary and meaningless. The initial ridicule that the Spot faced from other criminals, and even from Spider-Man himself, was based on his unusual appearance and seemingly absurd powers, with many people failing to recognize the incredible dangerous potential that lay hidden beneath his polka-dotted exterior. The development of the Spot's abilities over time revealed the true scope of his transformation, with his mastery of dimensional manipulation allowing him to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, travel instantaneously across vast distances, and manipulate matter and energy in ways that made conventional physics irrelevant. The battles between the Spot and Spider-Man were unique in their disorienting and surreal qualities, with the villain's ability to create portals anywhere on his body or in the surrounding environment, making traditional fighting techniques useless, and forcing the web-slinger to develop entirely new approaches to combat. Strategy. The philosophical implications of the Spot's existence raised questions about the nature of identity, reality, and free will that went far beyond typical superhero conflicts. His ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously suggested that conventional notions of individual consciousness and moral responsibility might be inadequate for understanding beings who operated outside normal space-time constraints. The tragic aspects of the Spot's character were heightened by his awareness of his own absurdity and the way his appearance made it difficult for others to take him seriously, despite the incredible danger he represented. This disconnect between his actual power and his perceived threat level created a form of psychological isolation that was unique among Spider-Man's enemies. The ongoing presence of the Spot in Spider-Man's rogues gallery served as a reminder of how scientific advancement could create threats that were completely unprecedented and difficult to categorize or understand using traditional frameworks for analyzing criminal behavior and superhuman abilities. Martin Li's transformation into Mr. Negative represented one of the most complex and morally ambiguous origins in Spider-Man's mythology, involving the intersection of corporate crime, human trafficking, and experimental medical procedures that created a being whose very existence challenged conventional notions of good and evil. The journey that brought Li to America began with the desperation of a man seeking to escape poverty and political oppression in China, where his skills and education were not sufficient to provide him with the opportunities he needed to build a meaningful life for himself and his family. The decision to trust human traffickers with his life and future was made from necessity rather than choice, reflecting the limited options available to someone in his circumstances. The betrayal that turned Li from a paying passenger into an unwilling test subject was orchestrated by Silvermane and other criminals who saw undocumented immigrants as perfect experimental subjects, people whose disappearance would not be investigated and whose suffering would not be reported or prosecuted by authorities. The experimental drug that was tested on Li was designed to enhance human capabilities in ways that could be useful for criminal organizations, potentially creating soldiers or assassins with superhuman abilities that could be controlled and directed towards specific objectives. The researchers involved in the project were more interested in the data they could gather than in the welfare of their unwilling subjects. The transformation that created Mr. Negative was not simply a matter of gaining superpowers, but the literal splitting of Li's personality into two distinct and opposing aspects that represented different approaches to dealing with trauma and injustice. The Martin Li persona embodied forgiveness, charity, and the desire to help others, while Mr. Negative represented vengeance, anger, and the willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. The psychological complexity of Li's condition was heightened by his awareness of both personalities and his ability to consciously choose which aspect of himself to express in any given situation. This was not a case of split personality disorder or mental illness, but a supernatural division that allowed him to embody contradictory moral positions without experiencing internal conflict or cognitive dissonance. The philanthropic activities that Martin Li pursued through his organization Feast represented a genuine desire to help the poor and disadvantaged people of New York, particularly those who had been failed by government agencies and social services that were supposed to provide assistance and support to society's most vulnerable members. The criminal activities carried out by Mr. Negative were motivated not by greed or simple malice, but by a systematic campaign to destroy the criminal organizations and corrupt institutions that preyed upon innocent people and perpetuated cycles of exploitation and suffering that Lee had experienced firsthand. The unique powers that Lee possessed as Mr. Negative allowed him to corrupt and control other people by inverting their moral nature, turning heroes into villains and criminals, into reluctant allies, in ways that reflected his own complex relationship with good and evil. This ability made him one of the most psychologically dangerous enemies Spider-Man had ever faced. The relationship between Mr. Negative and Spider-Man was complicated by the hero's genuine respect for Martin Lee's charitable work and his recognition that both aspects of Lee's personality were responding to real injustices and genuine needs that existed in their shared community. The battles between Mr. Negative and Spider-Man were not simply physical confrontations, but moral and philosophical conflicts that forced both characters to examine their own beliefs about justice, redemption, and the proper response to institutional corruption and social inequality. The ongoing presence of both Martin Lee and Mr. Negative in Spider-Man's world created unique storytelling opportunities that allowed writers to explore themes related to immigration, poverty, trauma, and the complex ways that good and evil could coexist within the same individual without negating each other. The duality that defined Lee's existence served as a metaphor for the way that all people contain the capacity for both great good and great evil, with circumstances and choices determining which aspect of their nature would predominate in any given situation. The tragic elements of Lee's story were heightened by the recognition that his transformation had been imposed upon him by others rather than chosen, making him both a victim and a victimizer whose actions were shaped by injustices that he had not deserved to suffer. Together, these modern villains represented the evolution of evil in response to changing social, technological, and economic conditions that created new opportunities for both heroism and criminality. Their presence in Spider-Man's world ensured that the themes and conflicts that defined the character would remain relevant and compelling for new generations of readers who faced different challenges than those that had shaped earlier eras. The sophisticated nature of these contemporary threats reflected the increasing complexity of the world itself, where simple moral categories were often inadequate for understanding the forces that shaped individual choices and collective outcomes. Their stories served as warnings about the unintended consequences of progress and innovation, while also affirming the ongoing necessity of individual moral courage in the face of systematic corruption and institutional failure. The legacy of these newer villains would influence future generations of criminals and heroes alike, establishing new templates for how power could be acquired, exercised, and resisted in an increasingly interconnected and morally ambiguous world, where the line between good and evil was often drawn by the choices that individuals made rather than by their circumstances or abilities. As we near the end of our journey through Spider-Man's vast pantheon of adversaries, we encounter perhaps the most complex and emotionally resonant category of all, those figures who exist in the grey areas between heroism and villainy, whose stories blur the traditional boundaries of good and evil, and challenge our understanding of what it truly means to be redeemed or lost. These tragic figures represent the possibility that circumstances, choices, and second chances can transform even the most unlikely candidates from enemies into allies, or from heroes into something darker and more morally ambiguous. The individuals we encounter in this final examination are united not by their powers or their methods, but by their fundamental humanity and their ongoing struggle to define themselves in a world that often seems determined to cast them in roles they did not choose. They remind us that the line between hero and villain is not fixed or permanent, but rather a boundary that can be crossed and recrossed as people grow, change, and confront the consequences of their past actions. For Spider-Man, these morally complex figures pose unique challenges that cannot be resolved through simple combat or clear-cut moral judgments. They force him to grapple with questions of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that good people can make terrible choices, while terrible people can sometimes choose to do good. Their presence in his world serves as a constant reminder that heroism is not about being perfect, but about continuing to strive for something better, despite our flaws and failures. These stories of partial redemption and moral complexity reflect the reality that most of us exist somewhere between absolute good and absolute evil, struggling with our own contradictions and trying to make the right choices, even when we are not entirely sure what those choices might be or what their consequences will prove to be. Felicia Hardy's journey from privileged socialite to the morally ambiguous Black Cat began in the rarefied world of New York high society, where wealth and status provided protection from most of life's harsher realities, while also creating unique forms of psychological pressure and moral corruption. Her father's career as a renowned cat burglar was hidden beneath layers of respectability and legitimate business success, creating a family dynamic built on secrets and double lives that would profoundly shape her understanding of truth, identity, and moral responsibility. The trauma that would ultimately drive Felicia toward her criminal career occurred during her college years, when a trusted boyfriend's violent assault shattered her sense of safety and control, while also revealing the inadequacy of traditional legal and social systems to provide justice for victims of intimate violence. The failure of institutional responses to address her suffering or hold her attacker accountable created a deep cynicism about authority and conventional morality that would influence all of her future choices. The decision to train in martial arts and acrobatics was initially motivated by Felicia's desire to ensure that she would never again be helpless in the face of violence, but these skills gradually became the foundation for a more elaborate fantasy of taking control of her life and circumstances through the embrace of her father's criminal legacy. The Black Cat identity that she created represented both a tribute to her father's memory and a rejection of the victim role that society seemed determined to assign to her. The planning and preparation that went into Felicia's first criminal activities reflected both her privileged background and her systematic approach to acquiring the skills and resources necessary for a successful career in high-stakes burglary. Her targets were chosen not just for their monetary value, but for their symbolic significance, representing the world of wealth and power that had failed to protect her when protection was most needed. The costume and persona that Felicia developed as the Black Cat were carefully designed to project an image of confidence, sexuality, and danger that directly contradicted the helplessness and vulnerability that she had experienced as a victim. The feline theme allowed her to embrace predatory instincts and territorial behaviors that were completely at odds with the passive femininity that her social background had encouraged her to cultivate. The first encounter between Black Cat and Spider-Man established the complex dynamic that would define their relationship for years to come, combining criminal activity with flirtation, danger with attraction, and moral opposition with genuine romantic connection. Felicia's immediate fascination with the web-slinger was based partly on his obvious heroism and partly on her recognition that he, like her, lived a double life that required constant vigilance and deception. The evolution of their relationship from adversaries to allies to romantic partners reflected Felicia's gradual recognition that heroism offered a more satisfying and meaningful way to use her skills and resources than simple theft, even as it also revealed the depths of her insecurity about her worthiness to be loved by someone as genuinely good as Peter Parker. The complications that arose from Felicia's lack of superhuman abilities created unique challenges in their relationship, as her desire to be an equal partner in their adventures led her to seek enhancements and modifications that would allow her to keep pace with Spider-Man's capabilities, while also making her feel less vulnerable and dependent on his protection. The bad luck powers that Felicia eventually acquired were both a blessing and a curse, granting her supernatural abilities that made her a more effective crime fighter, while also creating unpredictable effects that sometimes endangered the very people she was trying to help. The irony of these powers was that they provided her with the enhanced capabilities she had craved, while simultaneously making her more dangerous and unpredictable as a partner. The on and off nature of Black Cat's relationship with both crime fighting and Spider-Man himself reflected her ongoing struggle to reconcile her criminal instincts with her genuine desire to do good, creating a character whose moral trajectory was never entirely predictable or stable. Her periods of heroism were always shadowed by the possibility of relapse into criminal behavior, just as her criminal activities were often motivated by essentially heroic impulses. The psychological complexity of Felicia's character was heightened by her awareness of her own moral inconsistencies and her honest acknowledgement that she was drawn to danger and excitement in ways that made a completely conventional life impossible for her. This self-awareness prevented her from falling into simple victim narratives while also making her more sympathetic as someone who was genuinely struggling with difficult choices. The relationship between Black Cat and the broader superhero community was complicated by her criminal background and her reputation for unreliability, creating situations where her genuine contributions to heroic causes were often viewed with suspicion by heroes who had not learned to trust her motivations or methods. The ongoing presence of Black Cat in Spider-Man's world provided opportunities to explore themes related to redemption, second chances, and the possibility that people could change and grow beyond their worst mistakes while still remaining true to the essential aspects of their personality that made them who they were. Frank Castle's transformation into the Punisher began with the kind of ordinary happiness that made his subsequent fall into violence and vengeance all the more tragic and horrifying. His life as a loving husband, devoted father, and decorated Marine veteran represented everything that was admirable about American masculinity and civic virtue, making the destruction of that life a loss that resonated far beyond his immediate family circle. The mob hit that killed Frank's wife and children was not targeted at him specifically, but was simply the result of his family being in the wrong place at the wrong time, when criminal violence spilled over into the civilian world that was supposed to be protected from such horrors. The randomness of their deaths made the tragedy even more devastating, as it demonstrated how quickly and arbitrarily the foundations of a good life could be destroyed by forces beyond individual control. The failure of the legal system to provide adequate justice for his family's murder was the final blow that transformed Frank from a grieving victim into an agent of vigilante justice who rejected the moral and legal constraints that had failed to protect the people he loved most. His intimate knowledge of violence and weapons from his military service gave him the tools necessary to wage his personal war against crime, while his complete loss of faith in conventional justice gave him the motivation to use those tools without restraint. The methods that the Punisher employed in his campaign against organized crime were deliberately chosen to inspire terror and demonstrate his complete rejection of the mercy and proportionality that characterized traditional law enforcement. His willingness to torture and kill criminals who had never directly harmed his family reflected his belief that the entire criminal ecosystem was complicit in the deaths of innocent people and deserved to be destroyed rather than reformed. The psychological profile of the Punisher was that of a man who had died emotionally and spiritually along with his family, leaving behind only the skills and determination necessary to wage an unending war against the forces that had destroyed everything meaningful in his life. His apparent lack of fear or self-preservation instinct made him incredibly dangerous to his enemies, while also making him largely immune to the kinds of threats and bargaining that might deter other vigilantes. The relationship between the Punisher and Spider-Man was inevitably antagonistic due to their fundamentally different approaches to crime fighting and their incompatible philosophies about the value of human life and the possibility of redemption. Where Spider-Man sought to capture criminals and give them opportunities to reform, the Punisher saw such mercy as a betrayal of the victims who had died because society had failed to permanently remove dangerous people from circulation. The moral arguments that arose during their confrontations forced both characters to examine and defend their core beliefs about justice, violence, and the appropriate response to evil, in a world where institutional solutions were often inadequate or corrupt. These philosophical conflicts were often more intense and meaningful than their physical battles, as they represented genuine disagreements about fundamental questions of ethics and social responsibility. The effectiveness of the Punisher's methods in reducing crime and eliminating dangerous criminals created uncomfortable questions for heroes like Spider-Man, who were committed to non-lethal approaches to crime fighting. The undeniable fact that Frank's enemies stayed down permanently, while Spider-Man's often returned to threaten new victims, forced the web-slinger to confront the potential consequences of his moral restraint. The isolation that defined the Punisher's existence was both self-imposed and inevitable, as his methods made him unsuitable for teamwork with other heroes, while his complete dedication to his mission left no room for personal relationships or interests outside of his war against crime. This isolation was both a source of strength that allowed him to focus entirely on his objectives and a form of spiritual death that cut him off from everything that made life worth living. The tragic aspects of the Punisher's character were heightened by occasional glimpses of the man he had been before his transformation, moments when his essential decency and capacity for compassion briefly overcame his dedication to violence and revealed the genuine hero who had been destroyed along with his family. The ongoing presence of the Punisher in Spider-Man's world served as a constant reminder of the limits of heroic idealism and the potential consequences when good people were pushed beyond their breaking point by circumstances that exceeded their capacity to respond through conventional moral frameworks. Hobie Brown's transformation from the Prowler into a heroic ally represented one of the most successful redemption arcs in Spider-Man's mythology, demonstrating how guidance, second chances, and genuine human connection could help someone redirect their talents and energy from destructive to constructive purposes. The frustration and anger that initially drove Hobie to create the Prowler identity were rooted in legitimate grievances about social inequality, limited opportunities, and the way that institutional racism and classism prevented talented young people from achieving their potential through conventional means. His technological skills and innovative thinking could have made him a valuable contributor to legitimate scientific and engineering projects if he had been given appropriate opportunities and encouragement. The decision to use his abilities for criminal activities was motivated more by a desire for recognition and respect than by greed or malice, reflecting his need to prove that he was capable of extraordinary achievements even if society refused to acknowledge his potential. The elaborate nature of his early crimes demonstrated both his creativity and his fundamental desire to be noticed and appreciated for his talents. The encounter with Spider-Man that led to Hobie's capture and eventual redemption was marked by the web-slinger's recognition of the young man's essential decency and his understanding that criminal behavior was often a symptom of deeper social problems rather than an indication of inherent evil or moral corruption. The decision to give Hobie a second chance, rather than simply turning him over to law enforcement, reflected Spider-Man's belief in the possibility of redemption and his willingness to invest time and effort in helping someone who had made mistakes but retained the capacity for growth and positive change. The process of transformation from criminal to hero was gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring Hobie to overcome not only his own anger and resentment, but also the skepticism of a society that was reluctant to trust someone with a criminal background. His persistence in proving himself worthy of the second chance he had been given demonstrated his genuine commitment to becoming someone better than he had been. The various ways that Hobie used his skills to help Spider-Man and other heroes showed how criminal talents could be redirected toward beneficial purposes when combined with proper motivation and moral guidance. His ability to impersonate Spider-Man when necessary provided crucial assistance in protecting the web-slinger's secret identity, while also allowing him to contribute directly to heroic activities. The ongoing development of Hobie's character from reluctant ally to genuine hero illustrated the importance of mentorship, community support, and positive role models in helping people overcome difficult backgrounds and make better choices about how to use their abilities and opportunities. The relationship between Hobie and Spider-Man evolved from wary cooperation to genuine friendship, demonstrating how former enemies could become trusted allies when both parties were willing to look beyond past mistakes and focus on future possibilities for growth and redemption. The success of Hobie's transformation provided hope and encouragement for other characters in similar situations, showing that criminal backgrounds did not necessarily preclude heroic futures, and that society benefited when it invested in rehabilitation and second chances, rather than simply punishment and exclusion. The technological innovations that Hobie continued to develop in his heroic career often surpassed his earlier criminal inventions, suggesting that positive motivation and constructive goals could inspire greater creativity and achievement than anger and resentment ever could. The representation that Hobie provided as a black superhero was particularly significant in the context of Spider-Man's predominantly white supporting cast, offering readers from underrepresented communities a character who shared their background, while also demonstrating that heroism was not limited to any particular racial or socio-economic group. Together, these morally complex figures demonstrated that the categories of hero and villain were not fixed or permanent, but rather reflected choices and circumstances that could change over time as people grew, learned, and encountered new influences and opportunities. Their stories provided hope for redemption, while also acknowledging the real costs and consequences of past mistakes. The grey areas that these characters inhabited reflected the reality that most people existed somewhere between perfect goodness and absolute evil, struggling with their own contradictions and trying to make the right choices despite their limitations and flaws. Their presence in Spider-Man's world made the moral landscape richer and more realistic, while also affirming the value of compassion, understanding, and second chances. The ongoing evolution of these relationships and character arcs ensured that Spider-Man's rogues gallery remained dynamic and unpredictable, with former enemies potentially becoming allies, and former allies sometimes falling back into destructive patterns that required intervention and correction. The lessons that these characters taught about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of change provided some of the most emotionally resonant and morally significant moments in Spider-Man's mythology, showing how superhero stories could address real-world issues of crime, punishment, rehabilitation, and social justice in ways that were both entertaining and meaningful. Their stories ultimately affirmed the central thesis of Spider-Man's heroic philosophy, that with great power comes great responsibility, and that this responsibility includes not only protecting innocent people from harm, but also offering hope and opportunities for redemption to those who have lost their way and need guidance to find a better path forward. As our journey through the shadows of Spider-Man's world comes to an end, we're left with more than just tales of costumed criminals and superhuman threats. We've witnessed the human stories behind the masks. Tales of tragedy, obsession, corruption, and loss that transform ordinary people into extraordinary dangers. Each villain we've encountered represents a different facet of the human condition twisted by circumstance, showing us the delicate balance between heroism and villainy that exists within every soul. From Otto, Octavius's brilliant mind corrupted by power, to Norman Osborn's wealth and privilege poisoned by madness, from Flint Marko's desperate need for redemption to Eddie Brock's consuming hatred, these are fundamentally human stories, dressed in fantastic costumes. Spider-Man's rogues gallery endures because these villains reflect our own fears and failures magnified to comic book proportions. They show us what we might become if we let our worst impulses rule us, if we choose revenge over justice, power over responsibility, or self-interest over compassion. But they also remind us that redemption is possible, that even the darkest souls can find their way back to the light. In the end, that's what makes Spider-Man's story so compelling. Not just his power, but his unwavering belief that people can change, that tomorrow can be better than today. Rest now and dream of second chances, knowing that even in the darkest corners of the web, hope endures.